Dawn broke over the Pacific in 1945, and the island of Okinawa stood waiting, a fortress of rock. Jungle, where over 180,000 soldiers would soon clash in one of history's most brutal battles. This was no ordinary fight. It was the last great push before Japan's fall, a storm of fire on land, sea, and air. Kamikaze pilots rained down from the skies. Tanks crawled through mud, soaked fields, and soldiers fought through villages turned to ash. For 3 long months, Okinawa became not just a battlefield, but a graveyard of empires. Before we begin this journey through the entire Battle of Okinawa, tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and what battle should we cover next. Now, settle in, let history's echoes unfold, and drift with us into the story of Okinawa. Positioned at a precipice, a soldier felt the wind cut sharply through his fatigues. His face was a mask of grime, perspiration, and an emotion he refused to acknowledge. The terrain behind him still smoldered from the latest artillery strike. Before him, veiled by haze and soot, was only the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. An unnatural quiet had fallen, devoid of birdsong, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. Yet, just weeks before, this island had been an idyll. Okinawa, a chain of verdant hills and pristine coral shores situated in the Firth, East China Sea, a mere 300 miles from the Japanese mainland. It was a tranquil home to farmers, fishermen, and students. Then conflict arrived, and its idyllic nature was erased. In the early part of 1945, the world was engulfed in a violent upheaval. Nazi Germany was on the verge of collapse, and Tokyo was in flames from American incendiary raids. The war in Europe was drawing to a close, but in the Pacific, the conflict was set to intensify dramatically. The Japanese Empire was rapidly contracting. Island by island, American forces had systematically dismantled its defenses: Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, Leyte Gulf. The encirclement was tightening. Only a few strategic outposts remained before an assault on the Japanese heartland, and Okinawa was a critical one. But this was no ordinary island. It was the final gateway to the Japanese home islands. For the United States, Okinawa represented the last piece of the Pacific. Strategy, a location from which to launch the invasion of Japan. It was a flat, fertile island, large enough for airfields and close enough for bombers. Securing Okinawa would allow the Americans to conduct daily bombing, raids on Tokyo, enforce a naval blockade, and compel a surrender. The Japanese understood this, which is why they were prepared to make a final, desperate stand there. In Tokyo, the Imperial Army's High Command had made a solemn resolution. There would be no withdrawal, no capitulation, no negotiation. Okinawa was to be converted into a citadel of annihilation, a place where American casualties would be so catastrophic that Washington might reconsider a full-scale invasion of Japan itself. To the Japanese leadership, the war was already a lost cause, but national honor was not. They termed this strategy Ketsugo, the decisive battle. If they could make Okinawa a charnel house for the American invasion force, they might still alter the war's outcome, and so they selected their commanders. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, a quiet, disciplined officer who embodied ancient samurai principles in a modern military context. He was calm, brilliant, and fiercely loyal, the type of leader who would choose death over defeat. He was given command of Okinawa's defense. His deputy was General Isamu Cho, a fiery, aggressive commander who favored a glorious death over a tactical retreat. Together, they would transform Okinawa into a deadly trap. They had approximately 100,000 soldiers, But they also had a powerful ally, the terrain. Okinawa was unlike the other Pacific islands. It was larger, more rugged, and filled with ridges, valleys, and limestone caves, natural fortifications that they fully utilized. They burrowed into the hills, fortified ancient burial sites, and constructed miles of subterranean bunkers, machine gun emplacements, and artillery positions carved directly into the rock. They did not plan to defend the beaches. They intended to wait further inland, like a predator coiled to strike. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the Americans were orchestrating a massive operation, one even larger than D-Day. Operation Iceberg, under the command of General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., was said to be the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. It involved over 180,000 troops, hundreds of vessels, and thousands of aircraft. It was to be a tempest, a maelstrom of steel. But Buckner was not a reckless commander. He was aware of the challenge they were about to face. They had seen the heavy casualties on Iwo Jima, over 6,000 killed in just 5 weeks, and Okinawa was even more heavily fortified, even more staunchly defended. The Japanese were not in hiding. They were waiting, and they were prepared to die. But there was no alternative path forward. President Roosevelt and his advisors knew that Japan would not surrender without a fight. The enemy had shown no inclination for peace talks, no signs of weakening. On every island they had captured, the Japanese had fought to the last man. On Saipan, entire families had leaped from cliffs rather than be taken by the Americans. On Peleliu, Marines had used flamethrowers and grenades to clear out caves. Surrender was never an option. So Okinawa would be the ultimate test. Could America break the will of an empire? Or would the empire break them first? As March gave way to April, American ships began to assemble around Okinawa, forming a steel barricade. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers, over 1,000 vessels in total. The soldiers on board were briefed, drilled, and prepared for what was anticipated to be the longest and most brutal battle of the war. But they were unaware of what truly awaited them. They did not know about the caves, the kamikazes, or the mud that would cling to them like a second skin. They did not know that they would be fighting for 90 consecutive days in rain, decay, and devastation. And they did not know that Okinawa would claim over 240,000 lives before it was all over. On the island, Okinawan civilians prepared for the worst. Many had been told that the Americans would torture, kill, and even eat them. Japanese soldiers conscripted young boys to carry ammunition and trained girls to fight with bamboo spears. Families were instructed to die with honor, not shame. Some embraced this directive. Others simply wanted to survive. There were hushed conversations in the dark, stories of what had occurred on Saipan, mothers poisoning their children to save them from the beasts, fathers hiding weapons under floorboards, teachers weeping as they distributed grenades to teenagers. And all the while, the sea was filling with ships. The night before the invasion, a profound silence descended upon the island, a silence so intense that it seemed to amplify the sound of one's own heartbeat. Farmers huddled with their children in caves. Japanese soldiers meticulously cleaned their rifles. American Marines composed letters home, smoked cigarettes, and peered into the darkness. The sky was cloudy, and the air smelled of salt and smoke. In the distance, a dog could be heard barking. Or perhaps it was a wounded animal. No one moved. At dawn, everything would be different. But for now, the island held its breath. The stage was set. An island paradise converted into a fortress. An empire on the verge of collapse. An army prepared to fight a war that should have already concluded. and a generation of young men, Americans, Japanese, and Okinawans, about to be consumed by history. None of them knew it yet, but what was about to transpire would be remembered as the most brutal, most tragic, and most defining battle of the Pacific War. And it had not yet begun. Not yet. The boy was no more than 15. He had a basket of grenades strapped to his back, and he walked barefoot along a narrow path that wound between rocks and camouflaged bunkers. His hands trembled as he passed a Japanese officer who gave a silent nod. Ahead, the mountain seemed to swallow the trail whole, a tunnel carved into the limestone heart of Okinawa. Inside that mountain, men waited, silent and sweating, prepared to die. But this was not merely a cave. It was a fortress. By the time American forces landed in April of 1945, Okinawa had been transformed into something monstrous, a paradise defaced, a natural island converted into one of the most formidable fortresses in the history of warfare. The Japanese had spent months preparing for this, not for victory, but for annihilation, not to drive back the Americans, but to bleed them until they broke. And the island's very structure had become their shield. Okinawa is shaped like a comma in the East China Sea, rugged, uneven, a peculiar form with hills, ridges, and coral formations. For the Japanese, it was a divine gift, a landscape that could be adapted to create a new kind of battlefield, one that did not rely on tanks, aircraft, or speed, but one that turned the ground itself into a weapon. They called it defense in depth. In simple terms, it meant this: do not defend the beaches. Allow the enemy to land, and then bury them in a hail of bullets and steel as they attempt to advance inland. It was a strategy born of desperation. After the severe losses on Iwo Jima and in the Philippines, Japan had no illusions left. The Imperial Navy was in ruins, and their air force was crippled. What remained were ground forces and the tools they could carry. The only way to resist was to turn nature into a trap and make the Americans pay for every single yard of ground. And so, the caves. There were thousands of them, both natural and man-made, carved into hillsides, hidden beneath villages, and concealed under ancient tombs. Each one had been enlarged, reinforced, and stocked with supplies, machine guns, mortars, flamethrowers, and men who had been indoctrinated to believe that dying in defense of the emperor was the highest honor a soldier could achieve. Imagine trying to combat an enemy you cannot see, one that is stationary, one that waits. The Japanese soldiers concealed themselves in the darkness, deep underground, where even direct hits from bombs could not reach them. They carved firing slits into the rock, invisible from a distance, but perfectly positioned to fire upon approaching infantry. They set up wire traps, booby traps, and mines. They connected bunkers with tunnels, so that when one position was taken, the defenders could simply disappear and re-emerge elsewhere. The centerpiece of this subterranean hell was the Shuri Line, a massive, defensive belt that ran across the southern half of the island. It was not just a line on a map. It was a nightmare brought to life. Think of it as a row of jagged teeth spread across the ridges and hills. The Shuri Line consisted of 3 key positions: Kakazu Ridge, Conical Hill, and Shuri Castle itself. Each of these was layered, with trenches in front, bunkers behind, mortars hidden under camouflaged netting, and behind all that, tunnels leading to more tunnels. Soldiers could move without ever being exposed to daylight. They could fight, reload, sleep, and die, all underground. And above all this lived the civilians, Okinawan farmers and villagers, mothers, grandfathers, and children. Many of them were compelled to share these caves with soldiers. Others were ordered to dig or transport supplies. The Japanese command believed that if civilians were integrated into the battlefield, it would cause the Americans to hesitate, that their presence might protect the defenders. But it did not. And in many cases, it only exacerbated the situation. By April, over 100,000 Japanese troops were stationed on Okinawa. Most of them were part of the 32nd Army, an infantry force augmented with artillery and engineers. They were outnumbered by the Americans, outgunned, and cut off from any external support. But what they lacked in firepower, they compensated for with preparation. General Mitsuru Ushijima was in overall command of the defense. A quiet man, polite even, a former military attaché in Moscow, a thinker and a planner. He believed in sacrifice, but not in waste. His strategy was clear: force the Americans into a slow, grinding, and relentless advance. Make every hill a battlefield. Make every cave a grave. His second-in-command, General Isamu Cho, had a very different temperament. Loud, passionate, and a staunch believer in the code of Bushido, the way of the warrior. Where Ushijima was calm and methodical, Cho was fiery and obstinate. He often advocated for banzai charges, suicidal infantry assaults. Ushijima resisted. He knew that Okinawa was not the place for glorious charges. It was a place for a slow death, for patience, for suffering. Together, they transformed the island into something the Americans had never encountered before. The fortifications were so extensive that even Japanese engineers conceded that with another 6 months, they could have made Okinawa impregnable. But time was a luxury Japan no longer possessed. Still, what they accomplished was terrifying. There were spider holes, small pits concealed in the ground, just large enough for a soldier and his rifle. There were reverse slopes, hills where machine guns were positioned to face, away from the beach, to catch attackers by surprise as they reached the crest. There were hidden artillery positions, with guns that were brought out from caves only to fire, and then hidden again before airstrikes could target them. And then, there were the tombs. Okinawa was dotted with them. Traditional burial structures made of stone, containing family urns. Many were centuries old. The Japanese troops utilized them as ready-made bunkers. They removed the ashes, fortified the interiors, and used the curved roofs as natural protection against mortars. For the American troops, it was profoundly disconcerting to be fired upon from a place intended to honor the dead. Inside the caves, life was a misery. Humidity dripped from the walls. Rot spread through the rations and bandages. Wounds festered in the darkness. The only light came from flickering candles. The air was thin, water was scarce, and the noise, the constant echo of artillery from above, never ceased. When American bombs struck the surface, the shock waves would travel through the rock like thunder, rattling teeth and dislodging stones. But the men remained. They remained because they were ordered to, because they were told that their families, their emperor, and their entire nation were depending on them, and because many of them knew that they would never leave. They wrote farewell letters. Some carried photographs of their wives, children, or parents. Others carried nothing but the small blade they were instructed to use. When the time came, the blade for seppuku, ritual suicide. Death was not just accepted, it was expected. On the surface, Okinawan civilians lived in fear, caught between two adversaries. Many had no idea what was to come. Others believed the rumors that the Americans would murder and torture them and destroy their homes. So they followed the Japanese orders. They hid. They complied. Some were even given grenades and told to use them on themselves if captured. This was not just a military defense, it was a psychological one. If the Americans feared the caves, if they were reluctant to attack civilians, if they became bogged down in endless fighting, then perhaps, just perhaps, the war could be turned. But the Japanese had made one critical error. They assumed that the Americans would land and attack immediately, that they would storm the hills on the first day and fall into the trap. But that is not what transpired. On April 1st, American forces landed without encountering any resistance. The beaches were deserted. The inland roads were eerily silent. For 2 days, the 10th Army advanced north and south, almost unopposed. And that is when the fear began to set in, because they knew that this was not mercy, it was a setup. The Japanese had not abandoned the island. They were waiting, watching, buried in the rock and silence, holding their breath, while the Americans walked straight into the Dragon's Maw. And as American tanks rolled across the open fields, as infantry marched past the grassy ridges, as commanders radioed in reports of minimal contact, the storm was already gathering underground. They had not yet seen the enemy, but they soon would. The sky erupted with a deafening roar. But it was not the sound of a storm, it was the sound of steel. Off the coast of Okinawa, the sea was in turmoil as wave after wave of American warships moved into formation. More ships than the world had ever seen in one place. Battleships, carriers, destroyers, cruisers, a floating fortress of iron, and one fire, extending beyond the horizon like an endless wall of retribution. A Japanese officer, observing through binoculars from a fortified ridge, whispered to himself, "The end has come." But the end would not be swift, and it would come at a great cost. What lay offshore was the might of a nation that had been wounded at Pearl Harbor, bled in Guadalcanal, and forged in the fires of Iwo Jima. And now it had returned, not just to fight, but to bring the war to a close. In the early months of 1945, as the snow melted across the United States, something immense was in motion. The US military was preparing for its final and most brutal campaign in the Pacific, the invasion of Okinawa. This was not just another island on the map. Okinawa was the key, just 400 miles from the Japanese mainland. It was a crucial stepping stone, a launch pad for an all-out assault on the heart of the empire. The Americans understood this, and they knew it would not be an easy task. At the center of this maelstrom stood General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., the son of a Confederate general, now in command of one of the largest amphibious forces ever assembled. He was not a man given to theatrics, but to meticulous calculation. Buckner was aware of what lay ahead, a deeply entrenched enemy, thousands of miles from home, and a battle that would test the limits of human endurance. He also knew that the enemy was prepared to die, but so were his men, if it meant ending the war. The scale of the build-up was staggering. Over 1,600 ships were allocated to the operation, including more than 40 aircraft carriers, 18 battleships, 200 destroyers and escorts, and over 1,000 landing craft. It was not just a fleet, it was a tidal wave. And it was not just machines. The US committed over 500,000 troops, Marines, soldiers, sailors, and airmen, all trained, drilled, and hardened by years of island warfare. The main ground force was the newly formed 10th Army, a unique combination of Army and Marine units. They were veterans of Saipan, Tarawa, and Peleliu. Many had witnessed friends buried in the coral sand and seen jungle trees explode with shrapnel. Now, they were heading into the jaws of something even more formidable, Among them was Private First Class Harold Hal Simmons, a 19-year-old from Kansas who had falsified his age to enlist. He carried a photograph of his younger sister in his breast pocket and a rosary from his mother. "They say this is the big one," he wrote in a letter home. "If I don't make it, just know I was with the best damn men this country's ever had." Okinawa was not just another island-hopping campaign. The stakes were higher. The timing was critical. Washington wanted the island secured in time for the planned invasion of Japan later that year. Every general knew it. Every private felt it in their gut. In the lead-up to the assault, rehearsals were incessant. Training grounds in the Marianas were made to resemble the beaches of Okinawa. Amphibious drills were relentless. Cargo was loaded, unloaded, and reloaded until every crewman could perform their duties in their sleep. Pilots studied maps for weeks. Navy gunners practiced on imaginary targets with terrifying accuracy. Every movement, every order, every rifle was ready. Behind the scenes, engineers and logisticians achieved miracles. Supplies were amassed on an unimaginable scale. Food, fuel, ammunition, medical, kits, hundreds of thousands of uniforms, and millions of rounds of ammunition. Floating hospitals were prepared to treat tens of thousands of wounded. Blood plasma, morphine, and bandages were all packed with a grim sense of anticipation, because the command knew that this battle would be a bloody one. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. The morning sun rose over the Pacific, illuminating a line of American warships in perfect formation. The invasion force moved towards the beaches of Okinawa. The air was thick with tension and the smell of salt as the landing craft lowered their ramps. And then something strange occurred. Nothing, no resistance, no gunfire, no explosions. Just silence. The soldiers looked at each other in confusion. Many had anticipated the kind of beach landings they had experienced in Normandy or on Iwo Jima, machine gun fire sweeping across the waves, artillery pounding the surf. But there was none of that. The beaches were eerily deserted. Some men smiled, daring to hope that this might not be the hell they had imagined. They were mistaken. The silence was a trap, a calculated move by the Japanese Commander-General, Mitsuru Ushijima, a man of quiet discipline and profound resolve. Instead of defending the beaches and sacrificing his forces quickly, he had opted for a different strategy. Let them land. Let them advance deep into the island, and then bleed them dry in the hills, caves, and tunnels, where every inch of ground would cost American lives. And so, the Americans pushed inland, oblivious to what lay in wait. As they advanced, they saw signs, crude wooden crosses with Japanese inscriptions. One Marine lieutenant had a message translated. It read, "Welcome to the island of death." But by then, it was too late to turn back. American artillery units began to shell suspected enemy positions, their firepower shaking the earth. The naval bombardment, which had commenced days earlier, continued unabated. Massive 16-inch shells from battleships, like the USS Missouri, screamed into the ridges and hillsides, collapsing entire cave systems, or so they thought. But the Japanese had dug deep. Some caves were connected by tunnels hundreds of feet long, protected by layers of coral and reinforced concrete. Like a living organism, the island itself had become a weapon. The enemy was invisible, silent by day, and deadly by night. Back at sea, Admiral Raymond Spruance watched the operation unfold from his flagship. A veteran of Midway, calm and razor-focused, Spruance knew that victory would not be achieved through sheer numbers, but through grit, patience, and precision. The coordination between the 10th Army and the naval and air forces was seamless. Aircraft from the carriers flew constant sorties, bombing suspected strongholds day and night. The sky above Okinawa thundered with American might. B-29 bombers from distant air bases joined the campaign, targeting airfields and supply lines. But for all the technology, it was still men who had to move, shoot, bleed, and die. Sergeant Leo Martinez, a combat medic from Los Angeles, kept a journal. On April 3rd, he wrote, "2 boys from C Company stepped on a mine. I don't know their names. I tried to stop the bleeding. One was crying for his mother. I told him he'd be okay. I lied. He died in my arms." Stories like that were common. There was no rear line, no safe zone. Kamikaze planes, flown by desperate young men barely out of school, dove into American ships with terrifying regularity. Nearly every vessel bore the scars: blackened steel, twisted hulls and torn decks. The ocean itself burned, but still, the juggernaut pressed forward. By the end of the first week, the Americans had secured the northern half of the island with minimal resistance. But in the south, where the true Japanese defenses awaited, their progress slowed to a crawl. The ridgelines were honeycombed with bunkers. Every cave was a fortress, every valley a kill zone. And then the weather turned. The rain was constant, turning the earth to mud. Men slipped in the mire, their boots held fast by the clay. Trucks sank, weapons jammed, and wounded men lay in pools of water, calling for help as bullets whizzed overhead. General Buckner observed the situation with grim determination. He ordered more pressure, more airstrikes, more firepower. He believed, as did Washington, that Okinawa had to be taken, not just for military reasons, but for political ones as well. The world was watching. The Japanese High Command was watching. If Okinawa fell quickly, perhaps, just perhaps, Japan would surrender before the mainland invasion even began. But it would not fall quickly. And it would not fall without a price. The American juggernaut had landed. It had unleashed its fury. But now it was facing a battle unlike any before. A subterranean war against an unseen enemy. An enemy prepared to die to the last man to protect the soil beneath their feet. And in the shadows of Okinawa's hills, as the sun disappeared behind the smoke-filled skies, the island prepared to retaliate. The real battle was just beginning. The sea erupted, not with flames, but with shattering steel. A single massive shell tore through a ridge, hollowing out rock and earth in an instant, turning a hillside into rubble. Another slammed into a cave entrance, causing it to collapse silently amidst the thunder. Below deck, a sailor winced as the shockwave vibrated through his bones, sending coffee sloshing from his cup. Somewhere inside that mountain, Japanese soldiers tensed, hearing the roar and knowing their world was already beginning to fracture. This was no gentle introduction. This was war, days before the invasion. Before a single boot touched the sand, the U.S. Navy initiated a thunderous prelude, the naval bombardment. Ships lined the coast of Okinawa. They're massive. Guns aimed at the hillsides and ridges, at the caves and villages, at anything that moved or might move. The sea became the stage for a storm of shells, 16-inch rounds from the battleships, 8-inch shells from the cruisers, and rapid-fire barrages from the destroyers. Each bolt of fire marked the beginning of something irreversible. For the men on board, it was a mix of spectacle and dread. Radiomen double-checked coordinates. Gun crews polished their muzzle layers until they gleamed in the sun. Officers studied their maps, coordinating targets with a grim focus. Below them, more than 100,000 civilians huddled in the hills, instructed by Japanese officers to pray and remain silent. Many believed the American shells would kill them all before the invasion, but some found refuge in deeper caves, hoping the earth itself would protect them. The barrage commenced early one morning in late March. For weeks leading up to Easter Sunday, day and night, the horizon was aglow. Ship after ship fired thousands of shells. A battleship's main guns boomed like giant drums. Cruiser salvos rattled the windows. Destroyers unleashed rapid bursts. Each round soared across the water, flew over the coral reefs, crested the ridgelines, and crashed into the Japanese positions. The objective was clear: soften the defenses, collapse the caves, demoralize the men inside, destroy supply depots, and lay waste to the bunkers. In military terminology, it was called softening up, an attempt to make the defenders reconsider holding their ground. In simpler terms, it was meant to pound the island into submission before the soldiers landed. But nature fought back. Okinawa's terrain favored the defenders. The limestone hills absorbed many of the impacts. The shells cracked the rock, but did not always destroy the tunnels beneath. Japanese engineers had designed the caves to be deep and winding, sometimes 30 feet, underground, with reinforced coral walls that could withstand even the heaviest blows. When one entrance collapsed, the tunnels inside remained intact, and the defenders simply retreated deeper into the mountain. And the civilians, they watched. Women held their children close as pumpkin-sized holes appeared just yards away, shrouded in dust and flames. Old farmers took shelter near temple ruins, their hands covering their ears. A schoolteacher, clutching a piece of chalk, counted each blast in her head, 1, 2, up to 10, and prayed for mercy. For the sailors, the shelling was a mechanical world turned brutal. They were given their targets before sunrise. Then came the rumble, the heat, the smoke, and the vibrations across the deck. Gun crews loaded shells that weighed more than a ton, carefully, with precision, as if the fate of the world depended on their aim. Each shell carried the explosive power of dozens of aircraft bombs. Still, they fired wave after wave, for hours on end. When they paused, sometimes to reload, sometimes to reposition, the silence felt heavier than the guns. But then the next wave came, and the noise returned with devastating force. The Japanese defenders had no escape. Officers herded civilians into designated zones near the caves, or forced them to dig trenches that also served as disposal pits. Some young boys were made to carry mortar rounds, while girls carried water buckets or rations. They worked under watchful eyes, believing their labor might ensure their survival. General Ushijima observed the shelling from a command post beneath Shuri Castle. He felt each shockwave like a hammer blow, as if the island itself were convulsing against him. His second in command, General Isamu Cho, walked among the men, shouting orders, "Hold the line! Don't flinch!" Cho's voice was filled with intensity. He was a firm believer in Tokyo's plan to make Okinawa a fortress beyond conquest. Every plume of smoke across the ridges reinforced their resolve. Every crater was a reminder of their purpose. American planners watched the battle from their ships and submarines. Intelligence officers scanned aerial photographs to see where craters had formed, where smoke trailed up the hills, and where Japanese positions might have shifted. They updated their target lists daily. Admirals met with generals aboard the aircraft carriers. They strategized and debated priorities. Mostly, they wanted results, but the island did not yield. Meanwhile, aboard the hospital ships and floating medical units, doctors, prepared to receive waves of wounded, both American and civilian. Dozens of stretcher-bearers cleaned their equipment. Nurses arranged vials of blood plasma. The smell of antiseptic wafted through the corridors. Somewhere, a radio crackled with news. First wounded expected within 24 hours of landings. Everyone knew the bombardment was only the first chapter. More was to come. A sailor named James Jim Hanley, aboard a destroyer, wrote in a letter, "We fire these monstrous shells into that ridge, then stare over the side at the smoke, rising. You'd think we're cleansing evil, but hell, we're killing something. I don't even see the enemy. I only see rock and smoke. Yet, I keep pulling the lanyard." His understatement was profound. Many felt a sense of hollowness, uncertain whether their actions were righteous or simply numbing. At the same time, Marine spotters flew overhead in small planes called air spotters. Their job was to fly low over the hills to identify targets and direct the naval fire. They risked flak and bullets. One lieutenant, Claire Kit Hansen, radioed coordinates back to the battleships below, 200 yards to the right of that grove. Aim high. Fire in a series of 4. Moments later, a ridge collapsed in dust and flames. She whispered into her microphone, "Hit confirmed." Her voice was calm, almost detached, though her hands were trembling in the cockpit. By the end of that first week of bombardment, hundreds of targets had been hit. Ammunition dumps lit up like falling stars. Machine gun nests were destroyed, and villages burned. But still, the caves remained occupied. Still, the men inside prepared themselves. Still, the island breathed, damaged but alive. For the American crews, this was progress. Smoke billowed, craters multiplied, and conquest seemed closer. But beneath the surface, the real enemy watched, waited, and adapted. When the bombardment ceased, the defenders moved into new positions. When one cave collapsed, they retreated deeper. When the civilians panicked, they whispered instructions: stay calm, dig deeper, survive. The final act of this chapter of Selvos came with the heaviest barrage yet, a concentrated strike on Shuri itself. The battleships fired full salvos simultaneously. The earth shook. Windows shattered in distant villages. Atop Shuri Castle, caretaker officers ducked into the tunnels as the stones above vibrated. When the smoke cleared, the castle appeared scarred and damaged, but still standing, which meant something terrifying. If even Shuri could withstand the assault. What hope did the attackers have once the soldiers landed? And yet, from the decks, the gunners reloaded. The spotters checked their maps. The admiral spoke in clipped, firm tones. Prepare for landing day. Keep the pressure high. They believed the worst was over. But the Japanese were still breathing, still fighting. The island had absorbed the thunder and transformed it into resolve. The next wave of fire was on its way. The beaches would open. The soldiers would land. The real battle would begin beyond the explosions. And the island, with its secret tunnels, its hidden soldiers, and its civilians trapped in between, prepared for the storm. What would happen when the men on the beach met the men in the caves? When the shellfire ended and the silence brought a new kind of hell. The sky, guns smoked and ash-filled, held its breath. The island did not respond. The invasion was about to begin. The first wave reached the water, and nothing exploded. No mortar rounds, no gunfire, no chaos. The landing craft nosed into the shallow surf, but the beaches remained unnervingly silent. The men gazed at the shore, their hearts pounding, the wind only a whisper. It seemed too easy, too calm, like the eye of a storm before the real fury hits. Somewhere behind the hills, Japanese rifles were waiting, but for now, the land was desolate. Operation Iceberg was the code name. And on April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific began. Over 180,000 American troops were poised, while aircraft circled overhead. Ships were positioned offshore like steel sentinels. The landing craft creaked and rattled. The moment had arrived. As dawn broke, the light revealed wave after wave of boats moving across the glassy water. Soldiers clutched their rifles and helmets. Marines held their flamethrowers and demolition charges. Sailors kept the ropes steady. Young men from small towns, 20-year-olds like Tommy Collins from Ohio, watched the mist dissipate, saw the beach, and dared to hope that this might be easier than they had feared. But no one knew that the silence was intentional, a calculated move. Across the beach, flags fluttered in the breeze. With no resistance, the troops disembarked and began to unload their gear. Officers whispered their reports. Unopposed landing. No casualties. Securing the beachhead, the first regiments marched inland. Graves were dug for lives that were not lost. Planes circled overhead, dropping flares that cast an eerie light on the scene. In the calm, someone joked, "We're getting off too easy." The tense air was broken by laughter, but it was a nervous laughter. They all knew the deeper truth. The real battle was not at the shore. It was further inland, in the hills, in the tunnels, in the silence. Lieutenant Sarah Jennings, a communications officer, observed the beach from a command ship. She radioed in the coordinates, describing the terrain, valleys, cliffs, ridges, and coral formations. "No fire from the enemy," she recorded, her hands trembling as she typed the reports. "It's so quiet. It's unsettling," she messaged. All the men had to do now was advance. But where? The men from the 6th Marine Division and the Army's 47th Infantry Regiment began to push beyond the sand. Trucks rolled off the landing craft, carrying supplies. Bulldozers cleared paths. Engineers laid down roads. Onshore, signal flares zigzagged across the sky, marking drop zones and landing zones. Helicopters, a rarity in the Pacific War, buzzed overhead, mapping the terrain. But with every forward step, the tension grew. The men scanned the hidden ridges, the deep gullies, the thick brush. They anticipated ambushes, a stray bullet, a burst of machine gun fire. Something, anything. But the hills remained still. Thousands of Okinawan civilians streamed from their villages into the American lines, survivors with trembling hands and tear-streaked faces. Some cried, some smiled, some stared with vacant eyes. One mother, holding an infant, whispered, "Thank you," over and over, her voice broken. They had believed the Japanese propaganda that the Americans would kill them. Now they were fleeing into the arms of those who offered bandages and canned food. It was the calm before the storm. In the days preceding, cruisers and destroyers had relentlessly bombarded the Shuri defenses. Now, the infantry was advancing. The Marines practiced fire and movement, a technique where one squad provides covering fire while another advances. Commanders taught it like a dance for survival. Sergeant Paul Rogers from Texas led his men in lines, his voice echoing across the dunes. "Cover me, Johnson." "Go." They obeyed, their breathing ragged, their eyes sharp. But the trap was still set. For 2 full days, the 10th Army advanced as if on a parade ground. Casualties were minimal. Spirits were high. Some even wrote letters home. So far, so good. They talked of roast beef, baseball, and home. The island seemed welcoming. Japanese flags lay in tatters on the sand. A sense of victory was in the air. Inside the caves beneath the ridges, Japanese sentries listened. They heard the boots, the tracks, the engines. They smelled the spaghetti and canned corn. And they waited. General Ushijima's plan had succeeded. Let them land. Let them feel at ease. Then, close the jaws. American commanders held staff meetings aboard their ships. The maps showed their progress. The reports noted minimal enemy contact. They began to alter their plans for the second phase, a deeper push into the Shuri Line. Yet, one officer, a Navy intelligence analyst, noticed a detail. No dead bodies, no abandoned equipment, no battle damage beyond the shell scars. That is when a sense of alarm pierced the optimism. The silence was not mercy. It was strategy. At dusk on April 2nd, the American soldiers made camp inland, barely a mile from what they believed were enemy positions. Tents were erected, cots were unrolled, and the men ate their supper. Cigarettes glowed, and laughter broke out again, until someone mentioned Valentine's Day. That is when they remembered the date. Easter, a strange kind of peace mingled with dread. It felt surreal, but still, they moved forward at first light. On the third morning, tanks rumbled onto the ridges. Mortar teams set up, lobbing shells into the tree lines. Flamethrower units hovered over suspected cave entrances. Engineers laid down barbed wire. When one shovel hit the earth, a memory was stirred beneath. There lay tunnels. Perhaps they held the enemy, or bomb dumps, or civilians. No one could be sure yet. A young medic, Corporal James Young, treated the first wounded of the landing. Minor shrapnel injuries, shell shock, sunburn. Still, the nurses and doctors were in a rush. He touched a man's arm and felt the tremor of fear. He saw hope and horror in different faces. In one private's eyes, he read confusion. "Why is it so quiet before they hit?" the man whispered. Young had no answer. He just applied the bandages and listened. At midday, the scouts found the first real evidence of deception. In a field near a ridgeline, they discovered a Japanese communication wire, still intact. It led up the hill and disappeared into the scrub. No guards, no signs of retreat. The wire hummed with signals. The enemy was alive, and they were listening. That evening, the commanders held a council of war. Buckner's voice was low and precise. "Be cautious," he said. "The real fight begins tomorrow." That message was passed down through the ranks. Fear crept back in. Like a tide, the men had experienced too much calm. Now they braced for the unknown. The night sky was dark. The ships, offshore, continued their bombardment. Distant rumbles. It was an echo of the week before. A reminder that the calm on the surface could not last. Somewhere inland, the bunkers shifted. The tunnels echoed. A hidden man lay awake, listening. At dawn, on April 4th, the real battle would commence. But But for now, the silence persisted. The island held its breath. The American juggernaut had landed, but what lay ahead was still concealed underground. Last night's laughter had faded in the quiet between the gunfire. Every heartbeat spoke of what was to come. The soldiers who had smiled one moment might face hell the next. Operation Iceberg had begun, but the storm was still gathering. The sun was relentless, and the earth was parched, but the infantry marched on, their boots kicking up a dust that smelled of both victory and danger. A Marine scanned a ridge that should have been a source of gunfire, but saw only empty terrain. He let out a sigh of relief and wondered how long it would be before the trap was sprung, because what lay ahead was not peace, but an ambush coiled behind every silent green hill. American troops advanced inland from the beaches with surprising swiftness. On April 2nd and 3rd, 1945, units of the 6th Marine Division and the Army, 27th and 47th Infantry Regiments moved rapidly across northern Okinawa. They encountered only sporadic resistance. Old ammunition pits, abandoned foxholes, and minor sniper fire from the scrubby undergrowth. For many, it felt like a dream, calm, empty, and easy, a dangerous illusion. Colonel Robert Harper, 34 and a battle-hardened veteran, led his regiment through fields that had once been used for growing sugarcane. He guided his men past broken stone tombs, charred huts, and rusting farm equipment. The casualties were low, so low that the troops began to joke. "We're getting off easy." Their letters home were filled with optimism. "No trouble so far," they wrote, praying that the peace would last. But beneath that optimism, there was a sense of unease. Every rifleman, every squad leader, scanned the ridges with caution. They spoke in hushed tones of underground tunnels, of unseen caves. They shared stories from their last island campaign, of how the Japanese defenders had vanished only to re-emerge behind them. The memory of Iwo Jima's hidden guns haunted their progress. Still, they pressed forward. The engineers moved quickly, clearing roads and constructing makeshift bridges. The tanks rumbled over the coral, flattening any signs of resistance. The supply trucks followed, delivering food, water, and medical kits. The aircraft circled overhead, mapping the terrain with their cameras. They labeled their maps in real time: Ridge 123, Road 56, River 7. Forward Command established their schedules. The logistics were working like a well-oiled machine. Everything seemed to be falling into place. And yet, something was amiss. Private Samuel Sam Ortiz from New Mexico wrote, "We've taken nearly 3 miles in 2 days. No major fight. I get the feeling they want us here." But why? He paused in his letter, scribbling quietly. There's no sign of bodies, no wrecked tanks, no burned ammo dumps. Just earth and silence. Meanwhile, the medics treated minor ailments, blisters from the dusty hikes, sunburn, and dehydration. The nurses set up their field stations near the temporary camps. The men were soaked in a mixture of prayer and fatigue. They washed their uniforms in the streams and cursed the lice. Still, their morale remained high. Victory seemed within their grasp. However, as the columns moved beyond the flat northern terrain towards the hills that marked the Shuri defensive zone, the landscape changed. The sandy flats gave way to coral ridges. The vegetation became thicker. The air grew humid. A fog clung to the ground in the early morning hours, reducing visibility. The American scouts noted that the ridgelines were topped with fresh camouflage, netting and newly cut gun slits but there were few defenders to be seen. The structures were there, but they were empty. Captain Lisa M.C. Call, a military air spotter, circled overhead at dawn. She called in the coordinates. 3,000 yards ahead, a ridge topped with netting, at least 2 dug-in positions. Her voice crackled. Moments later, mortars pounded the area. The ground shook. And then there was silence again. No return fire, no resistance. At night, around the campfires behind the lines, the soldiers exchanged stories. One said he had been shot at during the night, but when he fired back, no figure appeared. Another reported hearing whispered commands in Japanese near his tent, but saw no one. Each tale added to the tension. The men realized that something was hidden, waiting. By April 5th, the forward units had reached the Motobu Peninsula in the northwest. They raised the stars and stripes over the burned villages. The civilians emerged, frail elders, children with hollow eyes. Some clapped, some cried, some ran forward. The American soldiers helped them to the field kitchens and wrapped them in blankets. Some of the survivors wept. Some whispered words of horror, of forced labor, of their fear of Japanese reprisals if they cooperated. The soldiers hugged them, shared their rations, and felt the true weight of the war's price. But even as their sympathy grew, so did their suspicion. The intelligence officers scanned the aerial photos. New tunnels had appeared, fresh earth mounds, smoke-free ridges, with cut logs lying still. No signs of retreat, no fleeing defenders. The Shuri Line seemed intact and underestimated. That detail made the planners uneasy. On April 6th, General Buckner met with his staff. The maps were spread across the tables. The reports came in, resistance still minimal, but scouts warn of possible ambushes, engineers warn of booby traps. A staff sergeant showed them pictures of steel spikes hidden in the ground and wire traps laid across the paths. The term tiger traps was used, holes covered by leaves into which a man could fall and be impaled. A grim humor. Nature's own minefields. Buckner's face remained calm. He stared at the maps. The lines showing the American advances forked into the hills, but he looked at the empty space behind those lines. He said quietly, "Let's not overextend." The message was passed down through the units. Advance with caution. Don't rush. Watch the terrain. Still. The men advanced. Colonel Harper's regiment moved toward the western flank. They reached the outskirts of Ye Take Ridge. So far, still no fight. But as they climbed, they found ammunition boxes buried under the leaves, unopened meal cans stacked neatly, and flintlocks set upright. Signs of retreat, but not of panic. On April 7th, the artillery finally spoke. Japanese guns, hidden in the caves, opened fire on the American positions. The first real shots. 7 soldiers died instantly. Dozens were wounded. The battlefield changed overnight. Corporal Ortiz felt the shell hit near him, throwing him to the ground. Blood ran in his ear. His friend, Private House, lay lifeless beside him. Ortiz scrambled behind the sandbags, his heart pounding. Nearby, shouts in Japanese echoed from the unseen caves. He realized the trap had been sprung. In the sudden chaos, the calm vanished. Mortars fell from unseen positions, raking the lines. Machine gun fire erupted from hidden bunkers. Panthers of bullet fire traced across the ridges. The silence was shattered. Panic and adrenaline crashed together. The men screamed orders. The medics ran across the open ground. Smoke trailed from the shells. All hell had arrived. The advance stalled. The commanders radioed in. Contact north of the ridge. Heavy fire. Entrench. Colonel Harper reorganized his men into defensive lines. The tanks were deployed, firing at the slopes. Airstrike planes roared overhead, dropping bombs on the suspected caves. Phosphorus rounds lit the ridgeline on fire. The smell of smoke, flesh, and fear filled the air. Up in the hills, a sniper fired. A Marine sniper, Clark Evans, his vision steady, picked off his targets from nearly 600 yards. His training had paid off, but for every shot, he knew there were many more hidden shooters. The jungle eyes were watching. At night, the wounded still moaned. The aircraft spotters overhead saved lives by radioing for medevac helicopters. Yet hours passed before the planes could land. Below, the nurses in the foxholes joined the survivors who carried the stretchers across the shell-pocked ridges. The hilltop looked like a graveyard. Every contour had a crater. In the shell-lit glow, General Cho's voice echoed through the caves. Hold at all costs. They must bleed for every inch. The soldiers inside the bunkers passed the ammunition silently. They moved quietly. The tunnels rattled with whispered orders. The women and children, forced to remain below, pressed against the walls. The air was thick and alive with determination and fear. Back in the American rear, General Buckner studied the maps, lit by a lantern. The forward edge of the Shuri Line was getting closer. Reports had come in about the cave networks stretching under the ridges, linking the positions. He clenched his jaw. The war had changed. The clear path north had turned into a labyrinth of death. Colonel Harper wrote in his journal, "We thought we had this place. It turns out we only had what they wanted us to see. Now we're in the maze." That line made its way into the war diary that night. It was later found in the battered pages. Weeks later, by the time dawn broke on April 8th, both sides had dug in. The American advance had lost its momentum. The casualties were rising. Defensive lines were formed along the ridges. The tanks and infantry guarded every angle. The engineers laid down concertina wire and claymore mines. The airstrike plans targeted the cave clusters. Yet still, the enemy remained underground, almost invisible. Inside the cliffs, the Japanese soldiers took stock. Their supplies were dwindling. The civilians huddled. Cho's voice grew from endless orders. Ushijima remained calm. They knew what was coming next. A slow, grinding battle that would last for months. A fight for every yard, for every stone, for each heartbeat. In the camps, the American troops lit their cigarettes at dawn. They waited. They cleaned their weapons. They saw no enemy, but felt its gaze. They ate their hard rations. They wrote more letters. Some whispered their regrets. Maybe we moved too fast. Others steeled themselves. We saw the trap too late. Now, hold the line. The inland push had begun with speed, optimism, and the belief in a quick victory. It had ended in gunfire, pain, and a prison of hills, the betrayal of silence, the rupture of calm. Operation Iceberg's second phase had opened, but the island had its own game now. Hidden tunnels, caves, and ambushes. Resistance where it was least expected. The American juggernaut had found its match. Not in numbers, but in nature, in planning, in sacrifice. And as the ridges filled with smoke and the tunnel mouths glowed with muzzle flashes, everyone realized that this war was only just beginning. What lay ahead was known only in one certainty: the island would never again be silent. The air was shattered by gunfire. An American platoon took cover behind the coral ridges, their backpacks soaked in sweat as tracer rounds zipped overhead like angry insects. They returned fire, but the bullets were coming from nowhere and everywhere, from hills that had been still only moments before. In that instant, a sense of dread hammered into every heart. They had walked into the trap. In the early days of April 1945, the American forces had pressed south across Okinawa with surprising speed. But ahead lay the heart of Japan's plan, the Shuri Line, a massive chain of fortified positions across the southern half of the island, stretched like razor wire across the ridges, valleys, and stone tombs. This was not just a defensive line. It was a crucible, designed to bleed the invader by forcing him into a slow, torturous grind. General Mitsuru Ushijima and his second-in-command, General Isamu Cho, had engineered this trap with ruthless precision. Their goal was to let the Americans feel secure, let them advance, and then lock them into battle after battle, ridge after ridge, cave after cave. A war of attrition they called defense in depth. In basic terms, it was a death maze carved into the limestone guts of Okinawa. Each layer, engineered caves, machine gun nests, and artillery bunkers, functioned like concentric jaws, waiting to snap shut. At first, it felt like a victory. The units had swept into the north with few losses. But as they approached Shuri, the terrain shifted. The rolling hills climbed higher, the vegetation thickened, the air turned heavy, and the visibility dropped. The first American regiments at the front lines broke through ridge after ridge, believing they were close to capturing the Japanese defensive heart. The engineers planted their flags, and the troops dared to smile. They did not know, at the crest of each ridge lay another trap. Inside the camouflaged netting, machine gun emplacements opened fire. The mortars hissed. The snipers, perched in their hidden pits, ticked off their targets from above. When the tanks pressed forward, they hit the hidden mines, explosive charges buried just beneath the surface, tied to trigger wires disguised under the leaves. The platoons watched as the tigers of metal clanged against the coral ground, pushing forward, only to be chewed apart. The American artillery responded. The battleships blasted the ridgetops. The naval barrages shook the hills, and the air support dropped its bombs. But the Japanese had built deep. Many of the tunnels were reinforced with coral concrete, some extending more than 30 yards underground. When the heavy shells hit, the tunnels collapsed overhead, but inside, the defenders either survived or simply shifted deeper. To the Americans, a ridge might seem to be destroyed, but the enemy had merely changed its position. The rain fell in the early morning as the Americans climbed towards Shuri Castle Ridge. The soil glistened, and a fog hugged the slopes. The forward scouts counted the camouflage positions, but the defenders were ghosts. The American squads whispered to each other, "They're still here." But where? The commands rang out, "Clear the ridge." The point had been taken. But at dusk, the cost was tallied. More than 100 soldiers had been killed or wounded. The hill had been surrendered, but the defenders lived on. Corporal Randall, Rusty Hayes from Nebraska, recalled the chaos. The curve of the ridge seemed peaceful. We thought we'd take it in an hour. By noon, the guys were screaming for medics. The bullets were coming through the soil. His voice broke on the playback. Months later, in his mind, a silent horror. The earth that had looked safe had betrayed them. In Osaka and Tokyo, the High Command monitored the reports. Japan's leaders hoped the grinding pace would force Washington to rethink its mainland invasion. If the Americans bled through Okinawa, perhaps they might reconsider dropping their anchors on Japan's beaches. The trap at Shuri was not just military, it was psychological, a warning, proceed and die in agony. The Japanese bunker network stretched underground between the key positions, Kakasu Ridge, Conical Hill, and Shuri Castle itself. Each anchor point was linked by tunnels, train supply corridors, and hidden passageways. The soldiers could vanish after firing. When one ridge fell, the defenders slipped to the next, emerging fresh, surprising the Americans who thought they had secured the ground. At night, in the American lines, the men whispered of movement in the ridges. The flashlights glared, and explosions punctured the darkness. The ground trembled. Those who had survived the day lay trembling in their foxholes, halfway between exhaustion and fear. In the command tents, the chairs rattled under the maps. The planners realized they were in a meat grinder, prepared for maximum pain. Meanwhile, the Okinawan civilians suffered. Many still lived in the tunnels beneath the Shuri Line, forced to dig, carry ammunition, or huddle in fear. Some of the women fainted under the pressure. The children cried without water, and the grandparents whispered their prayers. The Japanese command used them as human shields, hopeful that the Americans would hesitate to fire into the caves if civilians were inside. But when the artillery blasts shook the hills, the civilians prayed for death to come quickly, not in slow, painful chunks. The American medics had their hands full. The field hospitals were filled with men suffering from shrapnel wounds, broken bones, and psychological shock. The requests for air evacuation flooded in. The helicopters dropped in where they could. But the terrain made landing tricky. The nights turned cold. The men slept amidst their rain-soaked gear, deafened by the distant shell fire. The smell of antiseptic mixed with cordite and wet mud. General Buckner held his briefings in the forward command posts. He listened as the reports came in. Ridge cleared. Heavy enemy fire. Supply shortage. Tunnel network confirmed. The operational tempo flagged. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deepening. He said quietly, "We must keep moving. Our window to force a surrender is small." The men around him nodded, but their eyes held a shared concern. The Shuri Line was stronger than expected. As the American forces pushed deeper into southern Okinawa, the daily losses climbed. The tanks burned out. The medics dipped their bandages in the muddy streams, and the soldiers wrote home, "We're inching forward, but I don't know how long we can." The writers later captured that fear in their diaries, the dread not of dying, but of being buried alive inside a bunker. Inside the tunnels, Cho's voice called out in the dark, "Let them come! They will fall into the blades." The men sharpened their bayonets, prepared their grenades, and stocked their ammo. They didn't flinch. They listened to every crack above, the sound of boots, the distant chatter, perhaps a prayer. Then they waited to strike. In the trenches by Kakasu Ridge, the Americans dug their foxholes. The trenches were shallow, half dug-in notches in the coral. When the mortar fire roared, the men flopped into the holes, only to find that some were booby-trapped. Trip-wired grenades were perched inside. Private Martinez pressed down into the hole and felt something give, a groan from a fellow soldier. He pushed back, hard. The grenade rolled free. He kicked it, and it rolled into the open and went off. Martinez saved a life, but lost the hearing in one ear. As the days stretched into mid-April, the officers in both armies realized the true nature of the trap. This was not about ground, it was about will. The Japanese would not retreat. They would bleed the enemy until nothing remained. And the Americans had to break through, not just the walls, but the mines. In the smoky dawn of April 16th, the American tanks pushed onto the last ridge before Shuri Castle. The flames leaped, the barbed wire snagged, and the mortars exploded. The soldiers begged for artillery from the offshore ships that lay miles away. They fired in salvos, shaking the earth. But when the dust cleared, only one U.S. unit had taken the ridge, and at the cost of dozens killed. A lieutenant radioed in. Position gained, but at what price? That line echoed in the command posts. The craters pocked the hillside like scars. The men of the litter teams dug through the mud. The air rang with sobbing. The once optimistic advance had slowed to a crawl. The trap had snapped shut. And yet, the island had more chambers, more death corridors, and more tunnels beneath Kamikaze and Conical Hill and Shuri itself. The Japanese still had their strength. The American commanders saw the castle on a hill, glowing in the morning light, but a foreboding grew. To reach it meant crossing ridge upon ridge, cave upon cave, at a cost that might eclipse everything before. That night, in the forward lines, the soldiers lit their small fires. They mended their boots, cleaned their weapons, and wrote their last letters in their scrapbooks. Some whispered prayers to unseen gods. They stared into the darkness between the ridges and saw shapes shifting. A dog barked somewhere inside the caves. A distant radio chatter faded. The earth breathed. Operation Iceberg's heart lay ahead. And inside that heart, the trap at the Shuri Line pulsed like a wounded beast, ready to strike again. For the Americans, survival meant breaking through the coffin of ridges. But with each step, the cost grew. And only one thing was certain: the Shuri Line would not give up without demanding everything. As dawn cracked again, both armies braced. The next ridge lay beyond, but in its shadow, something far deadlier, obscured. Tunnels, hidden ambushes, and a will that refused to surrender. The trap had done its work. Now came the test. Could the Americans use their force to break it? Or would it break them first? The sky turned red. It sounded like a scream made of iron and fire. A Japanese plane, its wings ablaze, dove straight at the destroyer's deck at dawn. The explosion ripped through the ship, tearing through steel and flesh. Men were hurled, their screams swallowed by the smoke and flames. The ocean gleamed red. That moment, when man and machine became a bomb, shook everyone's world. This was Kamikaze hell. As the Battle of Okinawa raged below, another horror unfolded above the waves. Desperate pilots, barely out of their teens, climbed into small planes laden with bombs and fuel. Their mission was to dive straight into the American warships. No retreat, no return. In Japanese, they were called Tokutai, special attack units. In simple words, they were suicide pilots, and they came in waves. The Japanese Air Force, battered and outnumbered, had no illusions of victory in the sky. Conventional fighter action had failed, so they turned to sacrifice. The planes were stripped bare, loaded with heavy bombs, and painted with names like Cherry Blossom or Divine Wind. They were called kamikazes, the divine wind, sacred storms meant to crush the enemy. And Okinawa was their ultimate target. Offshore, the U.S. Navy had formed a radar picket line. The destroyers were spread out like islands beyond the main fleet. Their job was to watch the sky and warn of incoming attacks. But they were exposed, thin targets in an endless sea. On March 27th, the first wave hit. Dozens of planes dove out of the low clouds. The picket line exploded. The USS Bush, the USS Colquhoun, the USS Pringle were torn apart. Hundreds of sailors died in seconds. The flames turned the steel decks into ovens. Lieutenant Grace Evans, a nurse aboard a nearby hospital ship, wrote, "The radio crackled, hit on the picket line. Then came the smell of burning oil. We rushed to prepare, thinking of the wounded. What came instead was grief." She treated burn victims whose skin had bubbled, sailors who appeared to be alive but were not. Many whispered of a hell on deck. The cruisers and battleships closer to Okinawa fared no better. The USS Bunker Hill, a carrier, took 2 kamikaze strikes in one attack. The deck erupted in fire. Over 600 sailors were killed or wounded. The firefighting teams blasted their hoses into the blaze, the smoke choking the corridors. Yet amidst the chaos, men like Lieutenant Commander John Davis refused to abandon the ship. "We fought the flames with our hands," he said, his voice scorched, because giving up was not an option. The kamikaze attacks were not just waves of terror, they were precision missions. The pilots dove inverted, their engines shrieking, aiming for the flight decks, the stacks, the fuel lines. Their goal was to cripple the air power and stop the land support. Each hit meant fewer planes overhead for the American troops advancing inland. Each ship lost meant fewer guns pounding the hillside targets. The radio controllers and radar watchers grew weary. Every blip could be a bomber or a suicide plane. At night, the searchlights cut through the clouds. The anti-aircraft guns cranked up from the destroyers, the cruisers, the battleships. The flak bursts cracked above the waves. Each puff of smoke held hope or death, and sometimes both. Some planes broke apart in mid-air. Others hit their targets. Kikusui, the code name for the first large kamikaze strike on a carrier task force, came on April 8th. 22 planes dove in. 10 ships were hit. 3 carriers, 2 destroyers. Hundreds died. Flags burned. The brass officers stared in disbelief at the maps that showed steady progress inland. Now, every map showed holes. Yet, the sailors kept fighting. The men washed each other's wounds, covered the dead, and rescued the survivors from the water. Some cast the bodies into life rafts and held them until help came. Many prayed silently. In the deck hollows, the medics counted the body parts. Others whispered letters they would never send. Admiral Raymond Spruance looked at the aerial reconnaissance pictures. The kamikaze bases were scattered across the Japanese-held islands, airfields, bunkers, simple hangars. From these fields, young men took off, once, to drop their bombs not on the rock but on themselves. The intercepting planes had limited success. Many planes slipped through. The anti-aircraft rings couldn't cover every angle. On the picket line, the men called it the suicide ring. Every night, the convoys passed through, alert for incoming dark shapes. In one night, the USS Green shot down 7 planes, but 4 still hit ships nearby. Each explosion painted the waves with blood. In the wardrooms and scarped trenches, the soldiers and sailors formed their nightly routines: drink coffee, listen to the Morse code, pray, wait. The attacks came in waves: morning, afternoon, dusk. Then, sometimes, nothing. Then, again, no rhythm, just terror. On the American side, the naval air controllers tightened their coordination. The fighters from the carriers took off to intercept. The corsairs and Hellcats roared into the sky, chasing the smoke trails. Pilots like Ensign Charles Chuck Miller chased the kamikazes wherever they appeared. He said later, "One dove at me. I pulled sideways. He missed by inches and exploded into the sea. I saw his smile in the flame." He refused to say more. Below, the troops pushing inland watched the naval fires at night. They saw the silhouettes of the carriers, ablaze on the horizon. They heard the distant booms. Some thought the rescue ships would come, but for the American sailors, each attack felt personal. They calculated the numbers. Over 200 ships damaged, more than 40 sunk. Thousands had died or were wounded. The families aboard the ships sent their pictures home, their faces smiling, their faded letters speaking of calm motion. Then silence. No words for what had come. No one asked for the details. They just grieved. General Buckner saw the toll. His command had asked for naval fire support, and still the kamikaze strikes kept the ships steaming to shore. He knew the Navy was suffering, yet he dared to push forward. The infantry needed cover, and the ships provided it. The bond between the land and the sea was a lifeline, and now a battlefield. On shore, the medics spoke of seeing. The survivors from the ship attacks brought ashore, wounded, with blisters, broken ribs, and psychological shock. Some refused to talk. They stared at nothing. Others cried. When they heard the word kamikaze, that word carried their trauma. In the chaos of April 10th, the kamikaze strikes delayed a naval bombardment, scheduled to soften the inland defenses. The American commanders delayed the land advance. The tanks idled at the ridge bases, the artillery fell silent, and the supply ships stayed anchored. Every pause meant the Japanese defenders got stronger. Yet the attacks carried a cost. To Japan, too, the young pilots died, and the planes and support crews were lost. Each mission meant another absence at meals. The mothers received postcards from the sons they would never meet again. The Japanese officers jittered between hope and despair. Their sacred storms had wrought damage, but at the cost of a future generation. In Yokohama, the Imperial Command studied the results. Some questioned the tactic. Was it worth losing the pilots by the hundreds? Others answered, yes. If Okinawa costs the Americans enough, Japan might avoid an invasion. The scale of the sacrifice became a strategy. Each kamikaze plane was a cartridge in the final war ledger. Meanwhile, the Americans adapted. They created better coordination between the ship fighters and the radar. They introduced picket destroyer support groups, small groups of ships assigned to protect the picket ships from the flak teams. They raised their morale by honoring the surviving sailors and awarding medals. The sailors wrote letters to the families of the lost. The medals were pinned to shirts made of oilskin. One sailor, Petty Officer Mary Davis, wrote home, "He flew into hell to save countless lives ashore. That's not death. That's purpose." She pinned his purple heart to the wall of her cabin and remembered him daily. By April 14th, the American gun crews were veteran killers of the sky. The flak cut down the planes before their dives. The searchlights caught their silhouettes, and the planes were intercepted miles away. The losses declined. Still, some slipped through at dusk. At sunrise, when the cloud cover offered them cover, the sky turned red far too often. Then, a major strike came on April 18th. A wave of over 50 planes approached. For the first time, the kamikaze pilots dropped reserve bombs before dripping into their suicide dives. The impact was wider The USS Franklin, a carrier, burned for 72 hours. The flood pumps failed, and explosion followed explosion. Over 800 casualties. The fire teams worked around the clock. The nearby ships risked the drifting flames to rescue the survivors. General Buckner heard the news during a meeting. He clenched his jaw. The flames at the top of the command tent lit up the maps. He said quietly, "This war is not just on land." His voice hardened. The battlefield had expanded to the sky and the sea. By the end of April, over 300 kamikaze attacks had hit the fleet. The crews were relieved in the tired dark. The men fell asleep beside their guns. Some still wore their helmets. Others slept with their hands on their rifles. The terror had created a routine, but the island demanded even more. On shore, the infantry needed the naval fire to reduce the hill defenses. The ships needed the beaches to be secured. The sky attacks had become a deadly barter of death. For every ridgeline, a ship was attacked. For every ground advance, a plane burned in flames. Into May, the Japanese pilots flew in smaller formations, but with more precision. Their targets shifted to the landing ships, the ammunition carriers, the tankers. An attack on May 3rd sank the USS Legato, an escort carrier. The survivors witnessed the deck being flooded, the planes falling, the nurses jumping overboard. One sailor cried. The ship went in two halves. The men didn't even wait for the order. Oak pale dawns followed blazing nights. Every casualty echoed. Inland, every delay meant a slower advance, and every smile at a captured ridge became bittersweet when the sailors fell. In the caves near Shuri Castle, the Japanese defenders cheered the news of the ship losses. Their food supply was stretched, but their morale was lifted. They had baited the sea, and now the sea burned. They whispered, "Our ships die at sea. That means the supply for the land might come." The dream of turning the tide felt alive. The American planners watched, anxious. They knew the land operations couldn't stop, but at what cost? And every day, the naval logbooks detailed the battles lost or won over the miles of open water. The web between the sea and the land grew taut. At dusk, on May 6th, another kamikaze wave approached, but the American pilots intercepted it early. The score improved dramatically. Only 2 planes hit the fleet. The fire deaths were lower. The naval leaders realized their tactics were improving. Air dominance could blunt the storm. Still, at the front line, the infantry hesitated. They heard the engines drop, and the dives across the water. The screeching dive sound was familiar. Each man paused. The women and children caught in the caves above heard the distant explosions. The seas grew dark. In the end, the kamikaze attacks would kill more than 15,000 sailors and airmen and wound many more. The ships lost numbered 20, though dozens more were damaged. The sea had turned red, not just once, but every dawn, every dusk, every wave. And yet, the island still stood. The land battle raged. Operation Iceberg pressed on. The men on the land looked out toward the fleet, on fire. The smoke on the sea mirrored the smoke on the ridges. The war had no boundaries now. It shivered across the waves and into the tunnels. Kamikaze hell had turned the sky red, and it had only just begun. The seas whispered of death, and the Battle of Okinawa was anything but over. He saw the muzzle flash at the crest of the ridge and heard the bullets crack close enough to taste. A Marine froze, his heart pounding. A second later, his rifle bucked, and a pain shot into his shoulder. He fell backward into the coral. Around him, uphill, voices barked in Japanese. They had walked into something lethal. The trap had come alive. The fight for Kamikaze Ridge was the first real resistance the Americans had met on Okinawa's southern approach. It was April 19th, 1945. After nearly 3 weeks of cautious advance, the 10th Army had encountered the Japanese, defenders entrenched in their caves, bunkers, and interconnected fortifications. This ridge, a natural stronghold overlooking the Siki Valley, had turned into a killing ground almost overnight. The ridge was more than a hill. It was a fortress carved from coral stone. The Japanese soldiers, hidden in their slits and tunnels, could fire from 3 sides. Mortars rained down from above, and machine gun nests sprayed bullets across the open slopes. The banzai charges, the suicidal infantry assaults, erupted. The screams cut through the smoke. The Americans fought back with their grenades, their flamethrowers, and their bayonets. It was not war. It was hell. From dawn, the Marine units had prepared. They had studied their maps and used recon on foot, walking ahead to spot the enemy positions. Sergeant Thomas Tom Harding had crept forward with his squad, scanning the ridgelines with his binoculars. He had called the radio command. "One ridge to our front looks occupied. Camouflage netting, fresh footprints. Mortars ready." The command had ordered artillery and tank support, but nothing could fully soften what lay ahead. As the first wave had climbed, the mortar fire from the unseen caves had thudded into the column. Harding had heard the nearby explosions, and the Marines had dropped. The medics had dashed from foxhole to foxhole, pressing their bandages. Many were wounded instantly, their blood soaking their uniforms. The air was filled with the scent of burning flesh and rusted cordite. The Japanese defenders knew the ridge. They knew every hollow and every crest. From deep underground, they had lobbed their grenades. Some had curved to bounce into the enemy trenches. The flames from the flamethrowers had reached into the tunnels. The tanks had pushed forward and hit the concealed mines, exploding under their tracks with a monstrous force. Corporal Mary Garcia, an army medic, recalled rescuing a wounded man. His leg was shattered, and he had cried for his mother. Garcia had held his head, wiping away the blood. "Stay with me," she had whispered. He had died before she could change his bandage. Around them, the men had carried each other, crying out. But the ridge had not fallen. By midday, the casualties had soared. More than 100 Americans had been killed or wounded in just a few hours. That was high for a single ridge. The officers had radioed, "Cannot continue climbing without covering fire." But the ammunition was dwindling, and the supplies were struggling up the muddy slopes. The engineers had tried to cut their trenches. Those behind the front lines had heard nothing but the distant screams and the staccato of rifle fire. Captain James Robinson, leading the lead squad, had reported into communications. "We're pinned behind the coral. Need smoke cover and supporting tanks." The smoke shells, fired from the ships offshore, had drifted across the ridge, turning the daylight into a haze. Under that veil, the flamethrower teams had charged forward. Even the tanks had pressed in, the flames spitting in their wake. Close quarters combat had followed. The hard lines, the bloodied rifles, had touched the bayonets. The men had grappled, face to face. Inside the tunnels, the Japanese defenders had moved silently between their positions. They had reloaded, rested, and rearmed. The U.S. men had found Japanese letters buried in the tunnels, notes to their families, photos, farewell messages. In one pocket, a young soldier's picture and the words, "Protect the homeland." Their cause, their honor, their shame, their loyalty had turned them wild. On Washington's beaches, the Navy ships had watched through their binoculars. They had fired their 16-inch main guns into the ridgetops. Below, the powder smoke had mixed with the coral dust, but the shells had seldom reached the underground defenders. The ridge had appeared pocked, wounded, but alive. The heat waves had blurred the scene. The evening had come, and the rain had begun to fall, turning the ground muddy. The men had huddled in their foxholes. The flames from the burners dimmed. The silence had returned, but it was a tense pause, not peace. The engineers had still worked on the explosive clearing charges, so the troops could advance. The medics had dug through the mud to pull out the wounded men. The soldiers had whispered their letters home, in between the reverberations of the mortar fire. One had written, "I've never seen a war like this." The Japanese commanders had radioed in their reports to General Cho. "Kakuzu is holding," one officer had said. "They bleed hard. We are strong." Cho's reply had been grim. "Hold, even if it costs everything." Honor had demanded it. Through the midnight, the soldiers had stayed alert. Some had burned the pages of their letters to keep warm. Others had hummed hymns softly. All had listened for the next assault, knowing that the dawn would bring renewed chewing fire from both sides. At sunrise on April 20th, the engineers had detonated their charges under the Japanese bunkers. A concussive roar had rattled their bones. The troops had charged, their bayonets fixed. The rifle fire had returned. The Marines had surged up the slope, red with mud and gore. But the defenders had fought back, re-emerging from the tunnels to shoot at close range. Some had died in hand-to-hand fights. Some had died falling into the craters. The ground had swallowed the men. By dusk, the Americans had managed to take most of Kakuzu Ridge, but at a price. The casualties had climbed to over 200 killed and nearly 600 wounded. The ridge was theirs, but the Japanese defenders had simply retreated deeper, slipping through the tunnel networks to the next ridge, Conical Hill. The trap had snapped shut again. Colonel Harper had lost half a company. He had written later, "We thought a ridge was just a ridge. Now we know every ridge is a fortress." The radios had crackled, with reports of trapped squads needing evacuation. The engineers had built litter teams. The doctors had performed amputations in the muddy tents, and the men had slept sitting up. Yet the ridge's capture had brought a moment of grim resolve. The men, whispering together, had said, "We can take the next one." But each had known this was the hardest battle yet, and the Shuri Line still lay ahead. There were more ridges, more caves, and still the enemy survived. In the tunnels now occupied by the Americans, the gear lay hidden. The engineers had rigged explosives to collapse the passageways behind them, denying the enemy re-entry. But they had found the civilian remains, the scrolled notes on the cave walls. Some caves had been crucified with human suffering. The emotional toll had weighed on them. The troops had carried the rice cakes left beside the urns. They had touched the old offerings, remembering that the islanders too had suffered. In Washington and Tokyo, the high commands had watched the outcome. Japan's reports had glowed with pride. Kakuzu repelled them. Our warriors died in place. The American commanders had accepted the cost. General Buckner had changed his strategy. More air support, longer preparation before pushing ridge by ridge, more caution. But time was short, and the morale needed momentum. That night, both armies had paused. On one side, the twinkling fires around the tents. On the other, the hidden torches in the caves. Both had watched the ground between them, scarred, cratered, and dangerous. The ridge had belonged to America. The price had belonged to the men. The real journey through the Shuri Line had begun. Kamikaze Ridge was the first gate, and the survivors had known it wouldn't be the last. Each ridge ahead would demand more life, more grit, more heartbreak. And as the dawn had broken again, both sides had braced. The land had burned. The air had turned cold. The world had narrowed to a ridge, a tunnel, a heartbeat, and the echo of war beneath their boots. The scream came not from the shells, but from the people. A mother leaped off a cliff, clutching her child. A grandmother followed. A father bowed and whispered his goodbyes before jumping into the sea. Their bodies vanished into the blue. That moment, when life became death by fear, shook anyone who saw it. For the Okinawan civilians caught in the battle's path, the war was not distant. It was everywhere. On April 23, 1945, the reports had surfaced. Entire families were committing suicide, driven by fear, by forced orders, by the Japanese. Propaganda that claimed the Americans would kill, torture, and even eat them. It was not the truth, but it had become real enough to end thousands of lives. In the villages pressed beneath the ridges and caves, the civilians were told that salvation lay in death. The Japanese officers had distributed grenades, promising dignity in suicide, not shame in capture. The teachers and schoolgirls had received bamboo spears. The boys had carried ammunition, and the elders had carried the urns. One schoolteacher, a 32-year-old MS Higa, had told her class, "If capture comes, we choose death. The emperor demands it." Her voice had trembled, but many of the children had obeyed. The sky had offered no escape. The shellfire had rained down, and the spear and bullet had met the walker and the child. The corpses had lined the trails. In one cave near Shuri, over 200 civilians, packed within the tunnels, had suffocated or were buried alive when the passages had collapsed under the bombardment. By the time the American troops had discovered the site, the faces lay frozen in prayer. The stillness had held more sorrow than grief. The families that had stayed above ground had faced worse. The American soldiers, finding the civilians on the ridges, had tried to comfort them. They had offered them biscuits, water, and bandages. Many had collapsed in sobbing relief, only to drown days later, trapped in the cave tunnels during the shelling. Others had fled into the forest, only to starve or freeze. The ground itself had become their tomb. Corporal Thomas Kuwano, a local Okinawan guide, had led the soldiers through the destroyed villages. He had recognized the homes, the schools. He had pointed to the burnt rice fields, to the ulcer-scarred hillsides. He had wept, silently. He had found a grave, marked Mother, in chalk. Under it, the scorch marks. He had touched the stone. His father lay beneath. Kuwano had whispered, "They told us the Americans would kill. We hid. We died." That truth had burned deeper than the battle. The Japanese soldiers had used propaganda to deepen the despair. The leaflets were scattered across the caves. Americans bring disease and rape. Better to die with honor. The broadcasts over the unknown radios had claimed that a civilian uprising would doom the Americans and bring reprisals. Many of the civilians had believed it. Fear had become a stranger, and shame a friend. Mass suicide was not rare. It was widespread. In one small village near Kamikaze Ridge, 90 villagers had gathered at dawn. They had lined up, holding hands. The oldest man had recited his prayers. A girl, no older than 10, had closed her eyes. When the grenade was passed to her, she had dropped it, stumbled, and cried. Her father had pushed her forward and squeezed the grenade's lever. Smoke. Silence. That was the cost of control. The American medics had discovered the survivors, bloodied, shaken, and ludicrously alive. They had wrapped the wounded in their blankets. The nurses had whispered, "You're safe now." But the safety had come with its own guilt. The survivors had carried the stories of their lost fathers, mothers, and children. The living had haunted the living. In the military records, the term suicide villages had emerged. Clusters of civilian deaths, not from the fighting, but from fear. Over 200,000 Okinawan civilians had died during the battle, far more than the Japanese soldiers. Some estimates exceed 150,000. The houses had vanished. The culture had been shattered. The children had been orphaned, and the land had been scarred. The island's soul had been fractured. One American officer, Captain Anderson, had written home, "We're not fighting the enemy anymore. We're fighting the horror forced on helpless people." He had refused to accept the award medals. He had carried the photographs of the villagers who had smiled days before their end. He had placed them in a box marked Remembrance. By early May, the Japanese command had discouraged mass suicide, telling the civilians to stay hidden until the invasion had ended. But for many, the word had come too late. The fear was irreversible. Some had hidden in the caves for weeks after the fighting had ended, later emerging blind or ill. Others had remained frozen beside their fallen parents, waiting for release. The news of the mass suicides had reached Washington and Tokyo. The Japanese High Command had celebrated the early war propaganda as a triumph. But for Okinawa, it was a tragedy. America's leaders could not ignore the civilian losses when planning the post-war reconstruction. Many were ashamed. Many wept. The American soldiers had held impromptu memorials on the ridges. They had placed crosses beside the civilian graves. They had sung hymns in the forest ruins. Some had written the names, but most of the names were lost. They had prayed in their own way for the innocent. Throughout the campaign, the Okinawan civilians had suffered more than any soldier. They had been manipulated into death. They had died screaming, praying, crying, or silently hoping that someone would see them. Their despair was not the backdrop, it was the setting. And yet, among the ruins, the survivors had formed small communities. They had shared their rice, sung their old songs, and cared for the orphans. Their resilience had whispered that even in death's shadow, life could persist. As the American forces had closed in on the Shuri Line, uncovering more mass suicide sites, this civilian story would follow every ridge, every tunnel, every plan. The battleground had mislabeled the civilians as enemy supporters, but their suffering had lain in the crossfire between the commands, the orders, and the lies. The war had a face. It was not a soldier. It was a child's grey hand reaching from a collapsed trench. It was a mother's frozen eyes where mercy had claimed her. It was a silence thicker than smoke. And it was a fear potent enough to persuade souls into darkness. Mass suicide was not a footnote. It had defined Okinawa's despair when the sky had gone red with fire and the ground had shaken with battle. Somewhere, someone had chosen death rather than dishonor, and that choice had echoed far beyond the front lines. What had remained? A broken island and a quiet that had begged the living to remember. A destroyer exploded in a fiery ball. Steel splintered, men screamed, and flames shot skyward like a volcano. The sea beneath was a graveyard of oil and bodies. The USS Laffey had been hit by multiple kamikazes in one relentless assault. She had fought back, her guns blazing, but the damage had been catastrophic. That night, April 16, 1945, the ship that would not die had nearly sunk, but her ordeal was far from over. The Battle of Okinawa was not just fought on land. It was a war at sea, a deadly chess game played in the endless blue, where the US Navy faced its most harrowing trial, the Kamikaze storm. These suicide attacks were not mere raids. They were waves of death aimed at the radar picket line, the thin veil of destroyers and smaller ships that stood like sentinels far ahead of the main fleet. Imagine a line of ships scattered over miles of ocean, vulnerable, isolated, tasked with one mission: warn the fleet of incoming air raids. Their radar eyes scanned the skies, searching for the blips that could mean life or death. But this line was a target, bait for Japan's desperate pilots. To them, every destroyer was a prize, every ship a fiery altar. In this crucible, the sailors lived under constant threat. The ocean could be calm, the stars bright, but no one slept soundly. On the USS Laffey, the gunners kept watch, their fingers tight on the triggers. The mechanics checked the engines, and the radio operators listened for the faintest signal. Every face was tight with tension. The sky might explode at any moment. The kamikaze attacks began in earnest on March 27th. The planes came screaming from the clouds, their engines screaming, their wings tipped with burning fuel. They dived like meteors, aiming for the decks, the bridges, the stacks. The anti-aircraft guns spat tracer rounds into the sky, but many planes slipped through. The destroyers were small, fast, but against a determined crashing plane, they were vulnerable. The USS Laffey was a witness to hell. In less than an hour, 4 kamikazes had struck her. The fires had raged out of control, and the explosions had knocked men off their feet. Many had been killed instantly. Yet the crew had fought on. The firefighters had passed buckets, sprayed hoses, and torn away the burning debris. The officers had shouted their orders over the roar. Captain Frederick Beckton had refused to abandon the ship. "We will not die here," he had said. Other ships had shared similar fates. The USS Aaron Ward had been hit by 7 kamikazes in a single day. The USS Sangamon had been engulfed in flames after a plane had crashed into her flight deck. The USS Boris Bridge had been destroyed, but her crew had held the ship steady. Each story was one of courage amid the chaos. The radar picket line had borne the brunt of the kamikaze fury because it was isolated. The reinforcements had taken time, and the medical aid was hours away. The sailors had known that help might never come in time. They had formed tight bonds, trusting their shipmates with their lives. The smallest error could have meant death. These destroyers had crews of around 300 men. They had worked in cramped quarters, sleeping in shifts. Many were young, barely out of high school. They had written their letters home, unaware if they would survive the next dawn. One sailor, Seaman First Class Billy Harris, had kept a journal. On April 7th, he had written, "The sky is quiet now, but I know it won't last. We live to fight another day, or not." The radar operators had played a silent but vital role. They were the eyes on the edge of the fleet. When they had spotted the enemy planes, they had alerted the gunners and the fighters. Their information had saved lives. But when the screen had shown dozens of incoming aircraft, panic and hope had wrestled in equal measure. The anti-aircraft guns had fired relentlessly, 15 and 20 M&M cannons shooting thousands of rounds. The sky had been a deadly fireworks show. The flak had exploded in orange bursts, and the smoke trails had crossed in the twilight. The sailors had ducked behind the steel shields when possible, but the shrapnel had flown. Injuries were common. The mental strain was unbearable. The long watches under the sun and the stars, the smell of burning fuel and baby flesh, the sounds of the alarms, these had haunted the sailors long after. Some had talked about the screaming sky, the way the Kamikaze planes had seemed to have a scream that had chilled the soul. Many had kept their faith, others had prayed, and some had turned silent. Despite the horror, the destroyers had held their ground. They had saved the fleet from the surprise attacks. Their sacrifices had allowed the carriers and battleships to support the ground forces. Ships like the USS Laffey, the USS Pringle, and the USS Bush had become legends, nicknamed the Picket Destroyers or the Frontline Sentinels. Their story was one of tenacity, yet the losses were staggering. Nearly 75 destroyers and smaller vessels had been damaged or sunk during the battle. Over 4,000 sailors had been killed, and thousands more had been wounded. Each casualty was a life, a father, a brother, a son. The families had waited anxiously for the news. The ships had come back damaged, patched, and had returned to fight again. In the calm moments between the attacks, the sailors had written their letters, shared their photos, and sung their songs. They had looked out at the endless horizon, wondering what awaited them beyond. Some had dreamed of home, while others had feared what awaited them if they survived. Admiral Raymond Spruance, the commander of the fleet, had praised these men. Their courage saved the day, he had said quietly. But even he had known that the picket line was a gamble, a deadly shield made of human lives. On one dark night, the USS Aaron Ward had been hit by a kamikaze that had crashed into the bridge, killing the captain and many of the officers. The crew had rallied under the junior officers, keeping the ship afloat. Such moments had defined the war at sea: courage in chaos, order in destruction. The radio operators had kept their voices calm and steady. The medical teams had performed miracles. And the sailors had shared their water and their prayers with their injured shipmates. The sea had carried away the bodies, but the memories had stayed. By May, the American tactics had improved. The combat air patrols had intercepted more planes, and the radar picket groups had received better support. The kamikaze losses had increased. Still, the attacks had continued. Each dawn had brought fear, and each dusk relief. The battle for Okinawa's seas was a test of will. The Navy's greatest ordeal was not just the firepower or the machines. It was the men who had stood on the decks in the dark, facing the screaming storm. Their sacrifice had carved a path to victory, but the cost was etched in flame and blood. And as the fleet had steamed closer to the island, the kamikaze threat had still loomed, a fiery shadow over every wave. The jungle erupted in sudden gunfire. A squad of soldiers was ambushed from the shadows, bullets tearing through the leaves and bone alike. Sergeant Lewis dove for cover, his heart pounding as he counted his men. 2 were down, and 1 was screaming in pain. The enemy was nowhere to be seen, yet their shots were coming from all directions. The northern half of Okinawa was a maze of hidden killers. By late May, as the southern battles raged around Shuri, the American forces had turned their gaze northward. The island's northern half, vast and rugged, was far from pacified. What had seemed like an empty landscape was alive with pockets of resistance, Japanese soldiers who refused to surrender, guerrilla fighters lurking in the caves, and civilians caught in the crossfire. The mop-up campaign was brutal and slow. The northern terrain was a labyrinth of limestone cliffs, dense forests and underground tunnels carved deep into the coral. These caves were more than shelters. They were weapons. The Japanese used them to launch surprise attacks, to disappear like ghosts, and to trap the American units in deadly cat-and-mouse games. The soldiers faced the island's natural defenses as much as the enemy. The heat was oppressive. The bugs swarmed, and the mud sucked at their boots. Water was scarce. The thick jungle swallowed the sounds, making it impossible to know where the danger lurked. Every step could trigger a hidden mine or an unseen sniper's bullet. Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins, a combat medic, described the psychological toll. You never knew if the next moment was your last. The silence was eerie. Then suddenly, a shout or a gunshot. It was like the jungle was alive with death. Her diary entries spoke of exhaustion, fear, and determination. The Japanese defenders had learned from their past battles. They had split into small, mobile units, avoiding large-scale confrontations. Their goal was attrition, to wear down the American forces by striking unexpectedly and vanishing before they could be retaliated against. The guerrilla tactics had blurred the lines between soldier and civilian, between enemy and landscape. In one infamous incident, a platoon had entered a village they believed to be abandoned, only to be fired upon from the concealed caves. The sudden onslaught had killed several men before the survivors could regroup. The soldiers had fought back, using flamethrowers to clear the tunnels, an agonizing process that had sent fire and smoke swirling through the dark passages. Corporal Jim Evans recalled crawling into a cave after the battle. The smell was unbearable, he had said. Smoke, death, and something older, like the earth itself, was mourning. Inside, they had found makeshift shrines and the bodies of soldiers who had died days before. Some had notes clutched in their hands, messages to their loved ones, last prayers. As the days had passed, the mop-up operations had uncovered more guerrilla nests. Some of the defenders were fanatics who had fought to the last breath. Others were worn down and had surrendered quietly. The American troops had offered food and water to the prisoners, but the mistrust had run deep. Many of the prisoners had refused to speak, while others had whispered warnings of the ambushes that were waiting ahead. The civilians, caught in this northern turmoil, had faced devastation. The villages had been burned in the crossfire, and the families had fled into the wilderness, becoming refugees amid the chaos. One survivor, an elderly man named Okinawa Ko, recalled hiding with his grandchildren for weeks in a remote cave. We ate wild roots, he had said. We listened to the gunfire. We prayed the war would end. The mop-up was also a test of leadership and morale. The commanders had struggled to keep their men focused and safe. The soldiers had to balance aggression with caution, knowing that every careless step might mean death. The supply lines were stretched thin, and the medical evacuations were slow. The letters from home had become lifelines, boosting their spirits. The tensions had run high. Some soldiers had grown weary, questioning the cost of such grinding warfare. Others had found solace in small acts, a shared meal, a letter, a moment of laughter amid the destruction. Lieutenant Jenkins had written, "In the darkest times, we held on to hope. Even if it flickered like a candle in the wind, the northern mop-up had dragged on into June." The scale of the resistance, though diminished, had remained fierce. Even as the main battlefront had moved south, the snipers and booby traps had haunted the rear. The mines had exploded unexpectedly, claiming lives long after the front lines had passed. The patrols had moved cautiously, clearing the terrain inch by inch. The engineers had played a vital role. They had defused the mines, mapped the tunnel networks, and built the roads to improve the supply routes. Their work had saved countless lives. But the island had fought back relentlessly. Its caves and cliffs a fortress that no one wanted to storm. One day, a platoon had stumbled upon a hidden cave system that was far larger than they had expected. The Japanese defenders inside had refused to surrender. After hours of siege, the artillery and flamethrowers had forced them out. The battle had been fierce in the close quarters, with the soldiers fighting in the pitch darkness. When it had ended, dozens had laid dead on both sides. The cost of the mop-up was heavy. Hundreds of American soldiers had been killed or wounded. The Japanese losses were higher, but their unwillingness to yield had prolonged the fight. For the island's civilians, survival had often meant choosing between hiding or fleeing, both of which were fraught with danger. By mid-June, most of the northern resistance had been broken. The Americans had declared Okinawa to be secured, yet pockets of defiance had remained. The scouts had reported isolated gunfire, and some soldiers had vanished without a trace, swallowed by the jungle or a cave. The war was not fully over. The northern mop-up was more than a military campaign. It was a human struggle against nature, the enemy, and despair. Every ridge that had been cleared, every cave that had been searched, every sniper that had been hunted, had brought them a step closer to peace, but had left its scars on their hearts and on the land. As the sun had set over Okinawa's rugged north, the soldiers and civilians alike had wondered what lay beyond the battle. Would the island heal? Would the living forgive? The mop-up was a grim chapter, but the story was far from finished. The island had waited, silent and wounded, for what was to come next. The rain came without mercy. It fell like cold steel needles, soaking through the clothes and seeping into the bones. The earth surrendered to it, turning from solid ground to a sucking mud. The men struggled forward, their boots stuck and sliding, their weapons heavy with grime. The battlefield became a swamp, a quagmire of exhaustion, despair, and endless rain. April's warm winds had given way to the relentless storms. For the soldiers of Okinawa, the rain was more than the weather. It was an enemy that slowed every step, muffled every sound, and deepened every wound. The sky wept for a land soaked in blood and tears. Imagine marching through a wasteland where every footstep sinks knee-deep. The jungle had been transformed overnight. The leaves hung heavy with water, the rivers had burst their banks, and the roads had vanished beneath the pools of mud. The tanks and trucks had choked in the sludge. Every advance had required a Herculean effort. Corporal James Pfister had written in his journal, "We are not just fighting the enemy, we are fighting the mud, the cold, the endless wet. The rain turns our uniforms to rags, our spirits to dust." His words had echoed a truth that all the men had faced. The rain was relentless and unforgiving. The mud had clung to their boots and gear like a vice. The soldiers had dragged their bodies through it, their muscles screaming in protest. The supplies had become trapped in the mire. The food and ammunition deliveries had slowed, and the communication lines had snapped beneath the fallen trees and floods. The medical evacuations had turned perilous as the stretchers had sunk and the jeeps had stalled. The constant wetness had bred sickness. Trench foot, a painful condition from prolonged dampness, had spread like wildfire. The fingers and toes had blackened, swelled, and rotted if left untreated. Pneumonia had crept through the camps, stealing their breath and their strength. Dysentery and malaria had preyed on their weakened bodies. The battlefield was a hospital and a graveyard. Private Henry Lopez had described the mornings when the men had woken up shivering, their clothes frozen stiff. There was no dry place, no warmth, only the endless drip of the water and the ache inside. He had lost 2 close friends to disease long after the fighting had ceased. The mud had also changed the tactics. The artillery bombardments had become less precise, the shells sinking uselessly into the soft earth. The infantry assaults had slowed, as the soldiers had struggled to cross the soggy fields under fire. The tanks had become bogged down, targets for the enemy fire. The engineers had worked frantically, laying down corduroy roads, logs placed side by side to give the vehicles a fighting chance. Yet, the enemy had adapted too. The Japanese soldiers had used the rain to their advantage, slipping through the shadows and the waterlogged trails. They had known the terrain intimately. Their camouflage had blended with the mud and the leaves. The snipers had waited patiently, their patience fed by the weather's delay. The rain had reduced the visibility. The fog had settled low, wrapping the island in a grey shroud. The men had lost their way in the familiar forests, the signals had been missed, and the commanders had shouted their orders, which had vanished in the roar of the water and the wind. The trust between the units had been strained under the pressure. Despite these conditions, the battle had pressed on. The officers had inspired the troops to push forward. Sergeant Matthews had rallied his men through the squelching rice paddies, shouting, "We are made of steel, soaked but unbroken." His voice had been a lifeline amid the gloom. The psychological toll was immense. The endless rain had eroded their hope. The soldiers had longed for the sun, for dry clothes, for a sign that this hell would end. The letters home had spoken of the mud as an enemy as cruel as the bullets, letters that might never have been sent. The medical staff had fought to keep pace with the flood of disease. The field hospitals had become swampy tents, dripping with water and filled with the sick. The nurses had worked day and night, their faces weary but resolute. One nurse, Margaret O'Connell, had recalled, "We treated wounds that never seemed to heal, both of the flesh and of the spirit." The rain had also made the landscape more treacherous. The mudslides had torn through the hillsides, burying the men and the supplies. The rivers had swelled suddenly, washing away the bridges and the men. Every crossing was a gamble. The boats were scarce, forcing them to make dangerous fordings under the enemy fire. Yet amidst this misery, the acts of kindness had endured. The soldiers had shared their rations, wrapped their frozen feet in makeshift bandages, and sung their songs to keep their spirits afloat. Private Lopez had written of a moment when a soldier had given his last dry pair of socks to a comrade. In the mud and the rain, humanity had shone the brightest. As May had turned to June, the rain had begun to ease. The sun had broken through the clouds, revealing a landscape that was scarred and sodden. But the memory of those weeks had remained etched in every man's mind. Weeks when nature itself had seemed to fight alongside the enemy. The rain was not just water, it was a test of endurance, a trial of the spirit. It had slowed the war, but it could not stop it. For the men of Okinawa, survival had meant fighting the mud as fiercely as the bullets. And as the battlefield had drained and dried, another storm had awaited, one of fire, blood, and a final reckoning. What price would they pay to see the sun again? The mountain stood like a wall of death. The bullets rained down, the screams pierced the air, and the wounded lay trapped on a cliff's edge, helpless and bleeding. The men were falling every minute, some crushed under the debris, others riddled by the shrapnel. The battle at Hacksaw Ridge was chaos incarnate, and in the midst of this hell, one man moved against the tide of violence. Armed only with his courage, his conviction, and his determination to save, lives without firing a single shot, Desmond Doss was no ordinary soldier. A devout Seventh-day Adventist and a conscientious objector, he had refused to carry a weapon or to kill, believing in the sanctity of every life. Yet on Okinawa's deadly ridge, this unarmed medic became a legend, single-handedly rescuing 75 men who were trapped in no man's land, dragging them one by one to safety, often while under direct enemy fire. The story of Hacksaw Ridge is a story of faith meeting fury, of conviction clashing with carnage. It begins with Doss's quiet resolve, a man who had volunteered for the bloodiest battle in the Pacific, but had vowed never to kill. His fellow soldiers had doubted him at first. How could a soldier survive, let alone save others, without a rifle? They had mocked him, called him a coward, but Doss had stayed silent, his eyes fixed on a higher mission. The ridge itself was a fortress that had been carved by the Japanese defenders, steep, jagged, and covered in a deadly network of trenches, caves, and machine gun nests. The US Marines had faced hell as they had tried to take this strategic high ground, but every step had cost them their lives. The air was thick with smoke and the cries of the dying. The blood had painted the rocks red. On May 5th, 1945, the battle had reached its most desperate point. The American forces were pinned down, the casualties were mounting, and the wounded were stranded on the cliff, too exposed for the stretcher-bearers to reach. It was a death trap, and that's when Doss had stepped forward. Without hesitation, he had lowered himself down the sheer cliff face, a rope tied around his waist, braving the bullets and the shells. Each time he had reached a wounded soldier, he had calmed them, bandaged their wounds, and hoisted them onto his back. Slowly, he had climbed back up, his body straining against the weight, his heart racing with fear and determination. His actions were miraculous, not just for their bravery, but for their humanity. Doss was the lifeline for the men who had thought they would die alone in the mud and the blood. He had whispered words of comfort, shared his water, and refused to leave anyone behind, no matter how heavy or badly hurt. Over 12 hours, he had made more than 20 trips, lowering and raising the wounded. Men, one by one, against the deafening roar of the gunfire and the explosions. His comrades had watched in awe, many shedding tears. The medic, with no gun, had become the guardian angel of Hacksaw Ridge. His story was not just about heroism. It was about the power of belief. Doss had carried no weapon, but his faith was his armor. When he had been ordered to carry a rifle and shoot, he had refused, risking a court-martial. Yet his deeds on Okinawa had changed minds, proving that courage comes in many forms. Doss's Medal of Honor citation would later describe his extraordinary courage and unwavering devotion to duty, recognizing the lives he had saved under impossible conditions. He had become the first conscientious objector to receive this highest military award, a testament to a different kind of valor. But behind the medals and the fame was a man who had endured pain and trauma. He had suffered from exhaustion, wounds, and nightmares. After the battle, he had quietly returned to his faith, refusing to boast or to dwell on his deeds. "I did what I was trained to do," he had said simply. The legacy of Hacksaw Ridge had rippled far beyond the battlefield. It had challenged the notions of war and peace, showing that even amid the violence, compassion could shine. The soldiers who had once mocked Doss had come to respect and honor him as a brother in arms. Yet the ridge had remained a symbol of sacrifice. Hundreds had died there, and the battle for Okinawa had dragged on. Doss's miracle was a beacon in the storm, but the war was far from over. As the sun had set on Hacksaw Ridge, the men who had survived had carried with them the memories of the blood the mud, and the heroism. And Desmond Doss, the medic who had saved lives without firing a shot, had he remained a reminder that sometimes the greatest weapon is the will to save. Explosions shattered the early morning stillness. The walls cracked, the stones flew like shrapnel, and the fires ignited in the ancient heart of Okinawa's defense, Shuri Castle. The fortress, perched on a rocky hill, was a symbol of centuries of power. But now it was a tomb, a battlefield, and the epicenter of a brutal siege that would test the limits of endurance, courage, and human will. The siege of Shuri Castle was not just a fight for a strategic position, it was a battle for the soul of Okinawa, a place where tradition had met total war, and where every inch gained had cost lives that were measured in the hundreds. For weeks, the air had trembled with the roar of the artillery, the crackle of the gunfire, and the cries of the wounded. The American forces had seen Shuri Castle as the key to breaking the Japanese hold on the island. The castle's high walls and complex tunnels had made it a fortress unlike any other. The natural cliffs, the thick stone, and the maze of underground passages had created a deadly trap for any attacker. The Japanese defenders, led by General Mitsuru Ushijima, had transformed the castle into a fortress of despair. The soldiers had dug in deep, reinforcing the tunnels and laying their traps. They had known that retreat was not an option for them. Shuri was their last stand, a place to fight to the death. The siege had begun. In late May, the American artillery had pounded the castle relentlessly, sending clouds of dust and smoke into the sky. The massive shells had torn through the walls, collapsing the sections and sending the defenders scrambling. But the Japanese fighters were resolute, emerging from the tunnels to repel the attacks with a fierce determination. The infantry assaults had followed the bombardments. The Marines and army soldiers had advanced over the rocky ground, facing the machine guns and the sniper fire. The castle's twisted layout had forced them into close quarters fighting, hand-to-hand combat in the dark corridors, grenade exchanges in the tight rooms, and brutal clashes on the battered ramparts. Sergeant Tom Harris had described the horror. We were crawling through the broken walls, the smell of smoke and blood thick in the air. Every corner hid danger. Every step might be your last. The men had fought not just the enemy, but the exhaustion, the fear, and the crushing weight of the siege. The battle had tested the limits of their tactics and their technology. The engineers had blasted through the walls with their explosives. The flamethrowers had cleared. The tunnels and the medics had moved quickly to save the wounded in a maze of destruction. Communication was a constant challenge. The radios had failed amid the stone and the rubble, and the orders had to be shouted across the smoky battlefields. For the defenders, the siege was a desperate gamble. Their supplies had dwindled, and the exhaustion had gnawed at their bodies and their minds. Still, they had held on, using every inch of the castle to slow the American advance. Their commitment was as much about honor as it was about survival. Retreat with shame, surrender unthinkable. The civilians who were trapped near the castle had lived in constant terror. The families had huddled in the basements and the caves, listening to the relentless barrage above. One woman, Yuki Nakamura, had recalled the terror of hiding with her children, the walls shaking, the sky aflame. "We prayed for the war to end," she had said. But the castle held strong, and so did the fighting. The siege had dragged on for weeks. The American forces had suffered heavy casualties. Each gain was hard-fought, and each setback was a blow to their morale. The officers had urged the men forward, knowing that the castle's fall was vital, but fearing the cost. One pivotal moment had come when a battalion had breached a key tunnel, discovering a hidden network that had allowed the Japanese soldiers to appear unexpectedly behind their lines. The battle had become a deadly chess game, with each side anticipating the moves and counter-moves in the darkness. Lieutenant James O'Connor, leading a squad, had described clearing a tunnel. It was like fighting shadows. Every step was a risk. The air was thick with smoke and fear. "We lost good men that day." His voice had cracked with the memory, but his resolve had never wavered. The castle's fall had seemed inevitable. As June had begun, the Americans had pushed closer, supported by the relentless artillery and the airstrikes. The Japanese defenders, now exhausted and outnumbered, had fought fiercely, but with dwindling hope. Ushijima's command was clear: hold until the last moment. On June 21st, after weeks of siege, Shuri Castle had finally fallen. The battle had left the ancient fortress a ruin. The walls had been toppled, the tunnels had been collapsed, and the ground had been soaked with blood. The cost was staggering: thousands dead on both sides, countless wounded, and a scar on Okinawa that would never fully heal. The siege was a turning point. With Shuri lost, the Japanese resistance on the island had fragmented. The Americans had gained a foothold to press on toward their final victory. But the memories of that brutal fight had lingered. Stories of courage, sacrifice, and relentless determination. The survivors from both sides had carried the weight of the siege, long after the guns had fallen silent. The soldiers who had survived had spoken quietly of their friends who had been lost in the narrow tunnels, of the moments when hope had seemed to be gone. But the fight had never ceased. The civilians had mourned the loss of their homes, their history, and their lives. The Shuri Castle siege was more than a military engagement. It was a testament to human endurance in the face of destruction, a reminder that in war, the stones themselves seem to bleed, and every battle leaves a mark that is deeper than the earth. As the sun had set over the battered ruins, the island had waited. The siege was over, but Okinawa's story was far from finished. The final chapters of this devastating conflict were yet to come. The battlefield was chaos. The explosions tore through the hillsides, the smoke clouded the sky, and thousands of lives hung in the balance. Amid the thunder and the fury, two men stood as pillars on opposite sides: the American General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. and the Japanese General Mitsuru Ushijima. Their decisions, their wills, and their courage would shape the fate of Okinawa. Yet, their styles could not have been more different. Two commanders facing the same storm, leading their men through hell, but from worlds apart. General Buckner was a seasoned soldier, calm but decisive, burdened by the weight of his command. He understood the cost of every order, the faces behind the numbers. For him, the invasion was a mission with clear objectives, but every step forward was soaked in blood and sacrifice. His leadership was marked by a measured calculation, a seeking to balance aggression with care. In contrast, General Ushijima embodied the samurai spirit, resolute, honorable, and prepared for death before defeat. His leadership was rooted in tradition, duty, and an unwavering commitment to hold Okinawa at all costs. For Ushijima, surrender was unthinkable. Every decision was a testament to his belief in honor above life itself. As the battle raged, the pressure had mounted. Buckner had faced the challenge of coordinating the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific, managing tens of thousands of troops, ships, and planes. Each day had brought fierce resistance, mounting casualties, and difficult choices. He had wrestled with the knowledge that pushing forward meant more men would die. Meanwhile, Ushijima had commanded a shrinking force, cut off, low on supplies, and facing an overwhelming firepower. His options had narrowed. Yet, he had maintained discipline and morale. inspiring his soldiers to fight with a grim determination. His leadership was a beacon of resolve amid the storm. The tension between the two generals was not personal. They had never met. But it was symbolic. Buckner had represented the relentless advance of Allied power, while Ushijima had represented the last stand of a nation that was refusing to yield. Both had understood the stakes. Okinawa was the final gateway to Japan itself. Behind the lines, both men had faced their personal struggles. Buckner had known that the eyes of the world were watching his every decision. He was haunted by the losses, by the screams of the wounded, and by the burden of his command. His calm exterior had masked a deep sorrow for the lives that had been sacrificed. Ushijima, aged and weary, had carried the weight of his people's hopes and the traditions of centuries. The letters from home, the memories of his family, and the knowledge of his impending defeat had pressed on him. Still, he had held firm, his resolve steeling his men for the fight ahead. Tragedy had struck when Buckner was killed by artillery fire on June 18, 1945, the first American general to die in the Pacific War. His death had sent shockwaves through the command, a stark reminder of war's indiscriminate nature. The man who had led the assault with a measured strength was gone, leaving a vacuum amid the chaos. Ushijima's fate had been sealed soon after. Facing an inevitable defeat, he had chosen ritual suicide, seppuku, a final act of honor. His death had marked the symbolic end of Japan's resistance on Okinawa. But the battle had continued, fierce and unforgiving. Their stories reveal the human face of leadership under fire, not just of strategy and tactics, but of the burden of guiding men through an unimaginable hardship. Each decision had borne a weight that was far beyond the battlefield, shaping the lives, the hopes, and the histories. As the smoke had cleared, the legacies of Buckner and Ushijima had remained, two men leading, in vastly different ways, bound by their courage, their duty, and the tragic cost of war. Theirs was a duel that had been fought not with swords or guns, but with willpower and sacrifice. Echoing long after the guns had fallen silent, what lessons could be learned from their leadership? And how would their choices ripple through the final chapters of this devastating battle? The afternoon sky was thick with smoke, the air heavy with dust, and the distant roar of artillery. The men were entrenched in a deadly dance with death, moving cautiously through the shattered earth and the twisted metal. Then, without warning, a shell exploded nearby, its deadly fragments tearing through the silence, ripping into the heart of the command itself. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., the man who was leading America's largest amphibious assault in the Pacific, was struck down, the highest-ranking U.S. officer to be killed in action during the entire Second World War, was dead. The news had spread like wildfire through the ranks. The soldiers had paused, some in disbelief, others with a sudden, chilling awareness that no one, no matter how powerful, was invincible in this war. Buckner was not just a name or a rank. He was the steady hand that was, guiding them through the chaos, the voice of calm amid the storm. Now, his death had left a void that had rippled far beyond the battlefield. General Buckner was no stranger to war, a career soldier and the grandson of a Confederate general. He had carried the weight of his legacy and his duty with a quiet dignity. His leadership on Okinawa was marked by a careful strategy and an unyielding sense of responsibility for the men under his command. He had walked the front lines, listening to the reports, inspiring the troops, and making decisions that had cost thousands of lives, but lives that he had sought to preserve where he could. On June 18, 1945, Buckner had visited a forward observation post to assess the progress of his forces. The front line was a dangerous place, where every moment could be the last. As he had surveyed the terrain, a Japanese artillery shell, an 88mm round, was fired. It had struck near the command post, its explosion throwing debris and shards of metal into the air. Buckner was hit by the flying shrapnel and was instantly killed. His death was more than a tactical loss. It was a psychological blow. The men who had relied on his steady presence now faced an uncertainty. The chain of command had scrambled to adjust. Some had feared that the momentum of the battle might falter without him. Yet amidst the shock and the grief, the troops had pressed on, determined not to let his sacrifice be in vain. Buckner's passing had also underscored the brutal randomness of war. A general who had been shielded by his strategy and his rank was as vulnerable as any ordinary soldier. It was a stark reminder that the front did not discriminate, that leadership came with the ultimate risk. The impact of his death had reached beyond the battlefield. The messages of condolence had poured in from across the nation. The newspapers had memorialized the fallen general, praising his courage and his dedication. His family had mourned in silence, knowing the cost of his service. Yet for those who were still fighting on Okinawa, the loss was immediate and visceral. Lieutenant John Reynolds, who had served under Buckner, had recalled, "He was more than a commander. He cared about us, about each man." When we heard he was gone, it hit us like a punch to the gut. But we knew we had to carry on. For him, for our brothers. Buckner's legacy was cemented in the fierce battles that had followed. His plans and his orders had guided the ongoing assault, and his men had fought with a renewed resolve. Yet the shadow of his death had lingered, a somber echo that had reminded all of them of the cost of victory. In the days that had followed, the leadership had passed to others, but none could fill the space that Buckner had left. The war on Okinawa had pressed forward with an unforgiving intensity. Each decision, each sacrifice, was made in the shadow of the general who had fallen. The story of General Buckner's death is more than a chapter in a military campaign. It is a human story of bravery, vulnerability, and the heavy price that is paid by those who lead. It raises a haunting question. How do you carry on when the man who has guided you through the storm is gone? As the battle had raged on, the answer was forged in grit, in honor, and in an unbreakable will to see the fight through. The cost was terrible, but the fight for Okinawa was far from over. The ground trembled beneath the thunderous explosions as the Japanese forces made their final stand on the southern cliffs of Okinawa. The once lush landscape was transformed into a hellscape of jagged rocks, crumbling caves, and scorched earth. Here, amidst the narrow ridges and the hidden tunnels, desperation took hold, and the warriors prepared for a fight. That was unlike any other, a battle where survival was almost impossible and where death often chose its own time. The last days of the fight were marked by scenes of raw, harrowing courage. The Japanese soldiers had launched fierce suicide charges, running headlong into a wall of American guns. Their bodies were driven by a mix of honor, fear, and the unbearable weight of their defeat. They had charged not to win, but to make every breath count, to inflict as much pain on their enemies as they could before the inevitable end. The caves that had been carved deep into the rocky hills had become deadly prisons. The soldiers and civilians alike had huddled in the dark, the air thick with dust, smoke, and the suffocating sense of impending doom. These caves were both a sanctuary and a trap, places where life and death had mingled with a cruel uncertainty. Some had collapsed under the bombardment, while others had become the scenes of frantic, desperate fighting as the Americans had closed in. For the men inside, every moment was a fight for breath, for hope, for meaning. Lieutenant Hideki Yamamoto, one of the last commanders, had recalled, "The fear and the determination, we knew there was no victory left. Yet to surrender was a shame. We fought because it was all we could do. The American forces had faced a daunting challenge. The cliffs and the caves had negated much of their firepower advantage. Every step forward was met with a fierce resistance. Each collapse, each explosion, was a battle in itself. The landscape had become a maze of death traps and hidden enemies, turning the southern front into a grim chessboard of survival. The suicide charges had shocked the Americans. The men had watched in horror as the young soldiers had thrown themselves into the machine gun fire, refusing to retreat. These acts were not just military tactics, they were the desperate cries of a vanishing world, the echoes of a culture that had prized honor above life. The civilian presence had complicated the battle further. The Okinawan villagers who were caught between the armies had lived in constant terror. Many had hidden in the caves alongside the soldiers, trapped in a nightmare of violence and uncertainty. Some had been forced into impossible choices, to flee, to stay, to survive. Amid the chaos, the moments of profound humanity had emerged. The soldiers from both sides had shared brief truces to tend to the wounded, to offer water, to acknowledge the shared suffering beneath the violence. These flickers of compassion had shone like fragile flames in the darkness. The battle for Okinawa's south was not just a military contest, but a tragic drama of human will, a story of men and women who were caught in the gears of war, struggling to find meaning in their sacrifice and their loss. As the final days had worn on, the Japanese defenses had crumbled. One by one, the caves had been cleared, the ridges had been taken, and the resistance had been broken. The once formidable fortress had become silent, save for the echoes of the memories and the soft whisper of the wind through the shattered stone. Yet even in their defeat, the spirit of those who had fought there had lingered. Their last stand was a testament to the extremes of courage and despair, a haunting reminder that in war, victory often comes at a price that is too high to measure. What had remained after the guns had fallen silent was an island that was forever changed, scarred by the blood and the sacrifice of its defenders. The story of Okinawa's south is a solemn chapter, a closing act of fury, of honor, and of the tragic cost of a war that had pushed men beyond the limits of their endurance. As the dawn had broken over the battered cliffs, the island had held its breath, waiting for the final reckoning and the uncertain peace that would follow. The air was heavy with smoke and silence, pierced only by the distant echoes of gunfire and the low murmur of weary soldiers. Deep within the shattered southern stronghold of Okinawa, two men prepared for the final act of their lives. Generals Mitsuru Ushijima and Isamu Cho, the last pillars of Japan's defense. On the island faced an unbearable truth: defeat was inevitable. Yet in the face of collapse, they chose to embrace an ancient ritual, one of honor, farewell, and death. The moment was grim and charged with a profound solemnity. Ushijima, aged 62, and Cho, his trusted chief of staff, gathered their closest officers. There were no tears, no desperate pleas, only quiet acceptance. Their words were measured, steeped in tradition, echoing the values that had defined a lifetime of service. They spoke of loyalty, sacrifice, and the unbroken spirit of their homeland. In Japanese culture, the concept of seppuku, or ritual suicide, was a final, dignified act to avoid the shame of capture and to affirm one's honor. It was a practice reserved for warriors, a way to control one's fate when all else was lost. For Ushijima and Cho, this was not an act of despair, but of courage, a last stand beyond the battlefield. The generals donned their ceremonial robes, their faces calm but resolute. They offered their final instructions, and words of encouragement to their men, urging them to endure, to carry the spirit of Japan forward even as their own lives ended. The gravity of the moment weighed on everyone present, a silent acknowledgement of the brutal cost of war. Ushijima's sword was polished, a gleaming symbol of centuries-old samurai tradition. As the ritual began, Cho acted as the kaishakunin, the trusted aide responsible for ending the suffering swiftly. Once the act was performed, the air grew still, the tension thick as the generals prepared to meet death on their own terms. The act itself was painful and precise, a blend of bravery and ritual. When the sword fell, it marked not just the end of two lives, but the close of an era. Their deaths echoed through the shattered hills, a solemn punctuation in the savage symphony of Okinawa's battle. Outside the chamber, the Japanese soldiers grappled with the enormity of their loss. Some mourned in silence, others steeled themselves for the final phases of fighting. The generals' deaths were a heavy blow, but also a profound reminder of the values they had fought to uphold: duty, honor, and sacrifice. For the Americans advancing through the island, the news of Ushijima and Cho's deaths signaled the nearing end of resistance. Yet, it also brought a sobering respect. These men had chosen death over surrender, embodying a code that many found difficult to comprehend but impossible to ignore. The final hours of the battle were a mix of relief and sorrow, of victory and tragedy intertwined. The deaths of these generals were not just a military event. They were a deeply human story of men bound by duty, facing the unbearable with grace, and choosing their own fate when all others were lost. Their legacy lives on, a haunting reminder of the costs of war and the complexities of honor in the face of defeat. As Okinawa fell silent, the spirits of Ushijima and Cho lingered, a testament to courage, sacrifice, and the enduring shadows of history. What would become of those left behind? How would the island heal from the wounds carved by blood and duty? The answers lay just beyond the horizon, waiting in the fragile light of peace. The ground was soaked with blood, the skies were heavy with smoke, and the air was thick with the cries of the wounded. Okinawa, once a peaceful island, had become the bloodiest battlefield in the entire Pacific War. The cost of victory was staggering, beyond what most could imagine. The bodies had piled high, the hopes had been shattered, and the lives had been forever altered. The numbers alone tell a story of devastation, but beneath those cold figures lies a deep human pain, a trauma that is etched into the souls of the survivors on all sides. The battle had lasted for nearly 3 months, from early April to late June 1945. Nearly 250,000 soldiers had poured onto this small island. Americans, Japanese, and the Okinawan civilians who were caught in the crossfire. The Americans had brought an overwhelming firepower, tens of thousands of troops, aircraft and ships. But the Japanese defense was fierce and desperate. The fighting was brutal, often hand-to-hand in the caves, on the ridges, and across the shattered villages. The American casualties had numbered over 12,000 killed and more than 35,000 wounded. Men whose families back home would soon receive the devastating news. But the Japanese losses were far more catastrophic. Nearly 120,000 Japanese soldiers had died, many refusing to surrender, choosing death over capture, driven by a fierce sense of duty and honor. The island had become a graveyard, its landscape scarred by the war. Yet the most heartbreaking toll was suffered by the Okinawan civilians, who were caught between the two armies, manipulated by propaganda, and forced into unimaginable choices. Estimates suggest that as many as 150,000 Okinawan civilians had perished, roughly 1/3 of the island's population. They had died from the bombardment, from starvation, from forced suicides, and from massacres. The families were torn apart, the villages were destroyed, and a culture was forever changed. The psychological scars were as deep as the physical ones. The soldiers on both sides had wrestled with the horror and the guilt. Many American veterans had spoken of the nightmares that had haunted them for years, the memories of their friends who had been lost, and the innocent lives that had been shattered. The Japanese survivors had carried the burden of their defeat and their loss. The Okinawan survivors had mourned the destruction of their homes and their heritage, struggling to rebuild in the shadow of the war. The term battle fatigue barely scratches the surface of what these men and women had endured. It was a war that had stripped away their humanity, replaced by instinct and survival. Yet, amid the carnage, the stories of courage and compassion had emerged. The medics who had risked everything to save lives, the soldiers who had comforted each other in the darkest moments, the civilians who had shown kindness despite their own suffering. The cost of Okinawa was not just measured in numbers, but in the irreversible change to an island and its people. It was the cost of a war that had been fought with an unrelenting ferocity and the desperate hope for an end to the global conflict. The victory had secured a stepping stone toward Japan's mainland, paving the way for the war's final chapter. But at what price? The staggering loss had left a haunting question. Was the cost worth the gain? It was a question that had echoed through the hearts of all who had lived to tell the tale. As the island had slowly healed, the memories had lingered. The graves had marked the sacrifice. The monuments had stood in silent tribute, and the survivors had carried the stories forward. The Battle of Okinawa remains a solemn reminder of war's devastating toll. A chapter of history that has been carved in blood and courage. And yet, even after such darkness, life had endured. The island had been rebuilt, and new generations had grown up in peace. But the shadows of those months in 1945 have never fully faded. The cost of victory was etched into every stone, every story, and every soul that was left behind. What lessons remain from this brutal chapter? How do we honor the fallen while striving for peace? The answers unfold slowly in the quiet moments between history and memory. The island lay silent, but the silence was a heavy one, the kind that presses down on your chest, making every breath feel like a weight. Okinawa was no longer the lush, vibrant land it had been. Instead, it was an island of ghosts. The trees were stripped bare, the houses were reduced to rubble, and the fields were turned to mud and ash. The air smelled of smoke and sorrow, carrying the whispers of the lives that had been shattered by a war that had ravaged every inch of the soil. Walking through the battered villages, one could see the faces of the survivors. Their eyes were hollow, haunted by memories that were too dark to fully share. They moved like shadows, caught between the past and the uncertain present. Theirs were the stories of loss, of resilience, and of an enduring spirit that had refused to break, even as the world they had known had crumbled around them. The mass graves had dotted the landscape, silent reminders of the countless who had perished, soldiers and civilians alike. These unmarked resting places had told the stories of hurried burials, of desperation, and of the sheer scale of the death that had swept through the island. The families had searched in vain for their missing loved ones, clutching onto the fragments of hope amid the devastation. The cultural fabric of Okinawa had been torn apart. The temples, the shrines, and the centuries-old buildings had been reduced to ruins. The traditional ways of life that had been passed down through the generations were threatened by the scars of war and the arrival of the foreign powers. Yet, Even in the ruin, the spirit of Okinawa had endured. The small acts of rebuilding had begun almost immediately. A repaired roof here, a planted tree there, gestures of defiance against the overwhelming destruction. The psychological toll was immense. Many survivors had suffered in silence, carrying the invisible wounds that no bomb could have created. Post-traumatic stress, grief, and survivors' guilt had haunted countless souls. The island had become a place where the past horrors had lingered, where every corner had held a memory of blood and sacrifice. The US occupation had brought new challenges and changes, but also a fragile hope for peace and recovery. The bases had been established, and while they had marked a continued foreign presence, they had also provided jobs and resources for the rebuilding. Still, the shadow of the war had loomed large, coloring every decision and every day. Okinawa's natural beauty had slowly returned, but the scars had remained beneath the surface, in the land, in the people, in the stories that had been passed quietly from one generation to the next. The island had become a living memorial, a place where history and memory had intertwined in complex ways. And yet, amid the ruins, life had found ways to bloom again. The children had played where the battles had raged. The families had planted there. Gardens where the bombs had fallen. And the communities had forged new paths forward. The island of ghosts had begun to pulse with life once more, fragile, determined, and deeply aware of the cost of peace. What would it take for Okinawa to fully heal? Could the past ever be truly laid to rest? The island had held its secrets tightly, waiting for the future to unfold. The ghosts had remained, not just of the dead but of the memory, the loss, and the resilience. Their stories had whispered on the wind, a somber reminder of the price that had been paid for survival, and the hope that one day those shadows might fade into the light. The ground shook with the thunderous explosions. The air was thick with smoke and screams, and the men fell in waves, swallowed by the relentless fury of a battle that was unlike any that had been seen before. Okinawa was a meat grinder, merciless, unyielding, a brutal classroom where every lesson was carved in blood. As the dust had settled, the commanders and the soldiers alike had faced a grim reality. This was only a preview of the horrors that awaited if the war had dragged on to the Japanese mainland. The battle had revealed new truths about warfare in the modern age. The Japanese had turned Okinawa into a fortress of darkness and death. Their extensive network of underground caves and tunnels was a nightmare for the invading forces. These hidden layers, which had been carved deep into the hills and the cliffs, had allowed the soldiers to vanish, to strike, and then to disappear beneath the earth like ghosts. For the Americans, it was like trying to battle a shadow that could strike from any direction at any time. This subterranean warfare had demanded new tactics and an unyielding patience. The scale and the complexity of these fortifications had stunned the military planners. Imagine a city that was underground, with hidden rooms, supply caches, and narrow tunnels that were designed to funnel the attackers into deadly traps. This was not just a defense, it was a stubborn refusal to surrender. Each cave and tunnel was a tomb and a battlefield combined. Then there were the Kamikaze attacks, Japan's desperate and deadly answer to the overwhelming American naval power. The pilots, who were willing to crash their planes into the ships, had turned the skies into a blazing inferno. The U.S. Navy had suffered tremendous losses, with hundreds of sailors who had been killed and many ships that had been damaged or sunk. These attacks were terrifying, not just for their destruction, but because they had represented a fanatical commitment, a willingness to die rather than to yield. The human cost was staggering on both sides, but the kamikazes had forced a reckoning on how to defend the fleets against such suicidal tactics. The military strategists had pored over these lessons, understanding that if Okinawa was often this fierce, then the projected invasion of Japan itself would be unimaginably worse. The numbers were daunting. The Japanese mainland was vast, with millions of civilians and a military that was ready to fight, with the same desperation that had been seen on Okinawa. The defense plans had included even more extensive underground fortifications, civilian militias, and an unwavering resolve to resist the invasion. For the Americans, Okinawa had become a grim warning sign. The casualties that had been suffered on this small island, tens of thousands who had been dead or wounded, could have been multiplied many times over on the mainland. The projected bloodbath had weighed heavily on the leaders' minds, driving the urgent discussions about the alternatives to an invasion. The psychological toll on the soldiers was profound. Many were battle-hardened veterans, yet the relentless brutality of Okinawa had worn down even the toughest of spirits. The letters home had spoken of exhaustion, of sorrow, and of the haunting memories of their comrades who had been lost. The battlefield was not just physical but mental, a test of human endurance against the horror and the loss. Yet, amid the carnage, there were the stories of extraordinary courage and ingenuity. The American forces had adapted quickly, learning how to flush out the cave defenders with their flamethrowers and their explosives, slowly breaking the enemy's hold. The naval forces had improved their defenses against the kamikaze attacks, using the radar pickets and the fighter cover to reduce their losses. These lessons, which had been born of hardship, would shape the final stages of the Pacific War. But the greatest lesson was a question that was hanging in the air like smoke. How much more could humanity endure? Okinawa was a brutal preview, a mirror that was reflecting the potential nightmare of invading the Japanese home islands. It had forced the leaders to reconsider their strategies, to weigh the terrible cost of victory against the hope for peace. The meat grinder of Okinawa was a battlefield of shattered bodies and shattered dreams. Yet, it had taught the hard truths. It had shown the limits of force and the depths of the sacrifice that were required in a total war. The island's scars had spoken not just of destruction, but of a desperate will to survive on both sides of the conflict. As the world had looked toward the war's end, the echoes of Okinawa's lessons had remained, a somber reminder that beneath every strategic calculation lay the fragile lives of those who were caught in the storm. What choices would be made? What price would peace demand? The answers had waited just beyond the horizon. In the final, fateful chapters of history, the earth shook with the explosions. The sky was thick with smoke, and the screams of battle filled the air. Yet amid this hellscape, the children had moved through the chaos. They were the smallest faces who were caught in a war that had spared no one. Okinawa's children, who had been torn from their innocence, were forced into roles that they never should have known. Schoolboys who had been turned into soldiers, orphans who were struggling to survive, and survivors who were clinging to hope amid the ruin. In many villages, the boys, as young as 13 or 14, were drafted into the service. They were given rifles that were too heavy for their small hands, and uniforms that hung loosely on their thin frames. They had fought, not because they had wanted to, but because their island was on fire and their futures had burned with it. These children were a part of Japan's desperate last defense, the student corps, a symbol of a tragedy that was wrapped in youthful faces. Imagine a classroom that had been transformed into a battlefield, the desks that had been abandoned for the foxholes, and the chalkboards that had been replaced by the war maps. Their childhoods had ended overnight. Some of these boys had faced impossible choices. Amid the gunfire and the artillery, They had carried the weight of the adults on their shoulders, which had barely reached the rifle stock. They had known little of strategy or of tactics, only the raw need to survive, to protect their homes, and to obey the orders that had sometimes meant a sacrifice that was beyond imagining. The scars that they had carried were not just physical, but were deeply etched into their souls. But these stories are not only about loss. In the shadow of the destruction, the acts of courage and kindness had flickered like fragile flames. The children had saved their siblings, had shared their last scraps of food, and had risked everything to find water or medicine. Some had become unexpected heroes, risking their lives to help the wounded or to guide the lost civilians to safety. In the darkest of moments, their resilience had shone through. The survivors tell of how they had found ways to rebuild their shattered lives once the guns had fallen silent. The schools had reopened in makeshift shelters, and the children had returned to the lessons that had been interrupted by the war. They had planted their gardens on the bombed-out fields and had gathered to share their stories, a fragile attempt to restore a normalcy and to reclaim their stolen childhoods. Their laughter, though quiet and rare, had become a powerful act of defiance against the silence of the loss. Yet the shadows had remained long. Many children had lost their parents, their homes, and everything that was familiar. The trauma of the war had stayed with them, shaping who they had become in a world that was forever changed. Some had struggled in silence, their pain invisible, but no less real. The island itself had become a teacher of the harsh lessons of endurance, of sorrow, and of the fragile thread between life and death. Okinawa's children were not just passive victims, they were the witnesses to history, the living proof of war's far-reaching cost. Their stories remind us that behind every battle statistic lies a human face, often young and innocent, forever marked by events that were beyond their control. What had become of these children as peace had settled? How had they carried their past into a future that had demanded hope? The answers lie in their courage, in their struggles, and in the enduring spirit of a generation that had been shaped by fire. The island's youngest survivors had held on to their dreams amid the ruins, waiting for a world that might one day let them be children again, free from war's cruel grasp. And as Okinawa had slowly healed, so too had its children, the living legacy of a battle that had tested the very limits of humanity. The sky over Okinawa was stained with fire and smoke. The ground was soaked with the blood of all tens of thousands, and the battle was grinding on, a relentless nightmare that showed no mercy. As the island's shattered landscape had whispered the tales of death and of despair, a shadow had loomed far beyond the Pacific, a decision that would change history forever. The agony of Okinawa was not just an end, but a terrifying beginning. It had shaped the path that had led to a new, unimaginable weapon, and to the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Battle of Okinawa had revealed the grim truth to the American leaders. The war with Japan was far from over. The island, which was only a few hundred miles from the Japanese mainland, was a brutal preview of what an invasion of Japan itself would entail. The cost was staggering. The American forces had suffered over 12,000 deaths, and more than 30,000 who had been wounded. The Japanese military casualties were even more devastating, and the civilian population, which had been caught in the crossfire, had been decimated. These numbers were not just statistics, they were the harrowing signs of the price to come. The military planners had estimated that an invasion of Japan would have resulted in hundreds of thousands of American casualties and millions of Japanese who had been dead, both soldiers and civilians. The fear of a drawn-out battle, one that could have lasted for months or even years, had hung heavily over the halls of power. The meat grinder of Okinawa had become a dark mirror that was reflecting the horrors that were ahead. The island's fierce resistance, its fortified caves, its suicide attacks, and its fanatical defense had demonstrated Japan's willingness to fight to the bitter end. The battle had stripped away any illusions that the war would be won quickly or easily. In Washington, President Truman and his advisors had faced an impossible choice: how to end a war that had seemed to be endless without sacrificing countless more lives on both sides. The answer had come from an unprecedented new weapon, the atomic bomb, a force that was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It had promised a swift and decisive end, but its use would have come at a terrible moral cost. The decision to drop the bomb was shaped not only by the scientific breakthroughs, but by the bloody lessons of Okinawa. The brutal price that had been paid by the American and Japanese soldiers and the civilians on that island had hardened their resolve and had sharpened their sense of urgency. The stakes could not have been higher. Many soldiers who had fought on Okinawa had carried the scars, both seen and unseen, of what they had endured. They had understood the scale of the destruction that would have come with an invasion of Japan itself. The letters Holmes had spoken of exhaustion, of sorrow, and of the haunting memories of their comrades who had been lost. For them, the atomic bomb was seen as a grim but necessary end to an unimaginable suffering. Yet, the decision was far from simple. The ethical questions and the human cost had weighed heavily on those who had wielded such power. The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, innocent and ancient, would soon become the symbols of a devastation that was unlike any before. Okinawa had shown the world the terrible price of a total war, a price that many had hoped would never have to be paid again. But as the sun had set over the island's shattered hills, the course was set for a final act, a new kind of horror that would reshape history forever. What had unfolded next would test humanity's conscience, would redefine warfare, and would leave echoes that resonate to this day. The road from Okinawa to Hiroshima was paved with blood, with sacrifice, and with impossible choices. A path that none could have foreseen, but that all must remember. The dust had barely settled on the blood-soaked soil of Okinawa when the heavy machinery of occupation rolled in. The screams of the battle had faded into an eerie silence, which was broken only by the soft footsteps of the soldiers who were now tasked with a new mission. Not to fight, but to hold and to rebuild. The island, which had once been a fierce battleground, now lay in ruins. The buildings were reduced to rubble. The forests were scarred by fire and by shell, and beneath the ground, the countless caves and tunnels had whispered of the horrors that had taken place. Okinawa was no longer a battlefield. It had become a prize, a strategic jewel that was coveted by the United States. The American military occupation was the beginning of a new chapter, one that was marked by tension, by transformation, and by a complicated legacy that still echoes today. What was meant to be a temporary measure had quickly turned into a permanent presence, a sprawling base for the American forces that had reshaped not just the island, but the entire Pacific region. The island's people, the survivors of a war that they had never chosen, now faced a harsh new reality. The families had wandered through the shattered villages, clutching what little had remained of their past lives. The children, who had once been caught in the crossfire, now stared at the foreign soldiers with a mixture of fear, of curiosity, and of despair. The land itself had seemed to mourn, scarred beyond recognition, as the Okinawans had struggled to make sense of a peace that had been imposed. By the foreign powers, the occupation was not simply about control. It was about rebuilding the infrastructure, establishing the governance, and transforming Okinawa into a critical hub for the American military operations in Asia. The airfields were expanded, The naval bases were constructed, and the roads were carved through the mountains and the valleys. The island had become a fortress of American power. A forward base, the two, would serve as a launching point for the Cold War conflicts and beyond. But this transformation had come at a price. The cultural identity of Okinawa was threatened as the traditional ways of life had clashed with the military necessity. The land was seized, the communities were displaced, and the tensions had simmered beneath the surface. The American presence had brought security and economic opportunities, but also resentment and a lingering sense of occupation. For many Okinawans, the scars of the war did not heal with the end of the fighting. The memories of the loss and the destruction were compounded by the realities of the foreign rule. The generations had grown up who were caught between two worlds, their own rich heritage and the demands of a global superpower. The island's unique language, its customs, and its history had faced the risk of being overshadowed by the military bases and the geopolitical strategy. Yet, amidst the rubble and the hardship, the signs of resilience had emerged. The Okinawan communities had begun to rebuild their homes, the schools had reopened, and new generations were born into a world that was forever changed. The survivors had carried the stories of their courage and their survival, passing down the lessons about the costs of war and the importance of peace. The American military presence on Okinawa had also played a crucial role in the broader context of the global politics. As the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union had escalated, Okinawa had stood as a, quote, key outpost, a sentinel that was watching over Asia, ready to respond to the crises and the conflicts. The island's airstrips had hosted the fighter jets, its ports had welcomed the warships, and its soldiers had trained for the conflicts that would stretch far beyond its shores. But for all its strategic importance, Okinawa had remained a place of deep contradictions. It was a symbol of victory and of loss, of liberation and of occupation, of hope and of hardship. The island's people had borne the weight of history, their land a battleground and a base, their future uncertain, yet filled with possibility. The story of Okinawa after the battle is not just one of military might, but of human endurance. It is a tale of a community that is striving to reclaim its identity, of cultures that are intertwined, and of the long shadows that are cast by war. The island's transformation into a strategic base was only the beginning of a complex journey, one that continues to shape the lives and the histories to this day. As the sun sets over Okinawa's rugged coastline, the ghosts of the battle linger in the breeze. The island stands at a crossroads, a living testament to the cost of conflict and to the enduring spirit of those who survive. What lies ahead remains uncertain, but the story of Okinawa's aftermath is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human will to rebuild and to endure shines through. And yet, as the world moves forward, the questions remain: how will Okinawa reconcile its past with its future? What will it take for a true healing to come? The answers lie not just in the history books, but in the hearts of the island. People who continue to walk the delicate path between memory and hope. A single shell crater, which is still visible decades later, holds the weight of 1,000 stories. The ground beneath Okinawa whispers the secrets of devastation and of survival, the echoes of the screams, the thunder of the explosions, and the silent tears of those who had never left. This is a place where memory is carved deep into the land itself, where every stone, every tree, every monument tells a story of sacrifice and of sorrow. The Battle of Okinawa was not just a clash of armies. It was a human tragedy on an unimaginable scale. Over 140,000 people, soldiers and civilians alike, had lost their lives in those harrowing months. For the island's people, the wounds run deep. and the memories linger like the shadows in the evening light. But how does a community carry such a burden? How does a people remember when the pain is so vast and the loss is so profound? Across the island, the memorials stand as silent witnesses to the past. The Peace Memorial Park, which is nestled amid the rolling hills, is a place where the names of the fallen are etched in stone, a somber roll call of the lives that had been cut short. Here, the survivors gather on the quiet mornings to light their incense and to offer their prayers, their faces marked by time and by loss. They speak softly, their voices heavy with grief, remembering their loved ones who had vanished into the smoke and the fire of the war. The stories flow from the lips of the elders, vivid accounts of the moments that had been frozen in time, the mothers who had lost their children, the children who had become soldiers, and the families that had been torn apart by the confusion and the fear. These personal histories are the lifeblood of Okinawa's collective memory, which has been passed down like fragile heirlooms. Each tale, whether it has been whispered in a classroom or shouted in a protest, breathes life into the past and demands that it not be forgotten. Yet memory is complicated. For many Okinawans, remembering the battle means confronting not only the horrors that had been inflicted by the war, but also the pain of the occupation and the displacement. It means grappling with the reality that their island had become a pawn in a global struggle, its people caught between the empires. This dual legacy of suffering, as both victims and strategic assets, shapes how Okinawa mourns. The schools teach the history of the battle not just as distant events, but as living lessons. The children learn of the courage and the despair of their ancestors, of the mountain caves that had held the fighters and the refugees alike, and of the rivers that had run red with blood. The lessons are clear. War is devastating. Peace is precious, and the cost of conflict is always paid in human lives. The annual ceremonies mark the passing of each year, drawing thousands to remember. The survivors and the descendants stand side by side, united in their grief and their hope. They sing their songs of peace, release their lanterns into the night sky, and vow that the horrors of Okinawa will never be repeated. These rituals are both a balm and a beacon, a way to heal the wounds while shining a light toward a more peaceful future. Yet, even as memory binds the community, it also exposes the fault lines. The presence of the American military bases remains a source of tension, a constant reminder of a past that is unresolved. The protests echo through the streets near the bases, the voices rising against the noise, the accidents, and the incidents that rekindle the old fears. For many, the call for peace extends beyond the remembrance. It is a demand for justice and for respect. The battle's legacy also reaches beyond Okinawa's shores. The veterans from both sides, American, Japanese, and Okinawan, have shared their stories, seeking a reconciliation through an understanding. The international gatherings and the peace conferences have brought these voices together, weaving a fragile tapestry of a shared humanity out of the threads of the conflict. But the shadows of the war do not simply fade with time. They shape how Okinawa sees itself and how the world sees Okinawa. The monuments are not just stone and metal. They are the vessels of memory, the warning signs against forgetting. Each visitor who walks among the graves and the memorials carries a piece of this history home, transformed by the weight of the remembrance. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the island holds its breath, one can almost hear the whispers of the past. The memories rise like a mist, fragile, elusive, but ever-present. They remind us that history is not just about the dates and the battles. It is about the people, their fears, their hopes, and their sacrifices. Okinawa's memory of the battle is a testament to its endurance. It is a reminder that even after the worst of the horrors, a community can hold on to hope, that amid the ruins, life persists, and that mourning can be a path to peace. But the story is not finished. As the world changes, as new conflicts arise, Okinawa's call for peace continues. A plea that is carried by the winds that sweep across its battered hills and its serene shores. The battle may have ended, but its memory remains alive, urging us all to remember, to mourn, and above all, to strive for a world where such devastation is never repeated. And so, as the sun rises over Okinawa once more, the island stands both as a guardian of memory and as a symbol of hope, a place where the past is honored, the present is faced with courage, and the future is fought for with an unwavering commitment to peace. What will the next chapter hold? Only time will tell. But the voices of memory and of mourning will never be silenced. The sky had burned with fire. The earth had trembled under the weight of the countless lives that had been lost, and the air was thick with smoke, with fear, and with the bitter taste of death. Okinawa, the last great battle of the Pacific War, had etched itself into history with a ferocity that few conflicts could have matched. But beyond the thunderous echoes of the artillery and the cries of the wounded lay a deeper, more lasting resonance. The legacy of Operation Iceberg was not confined to the blood-soaked fields and the shattered cliffs of that small island. It had rippled through history, shaping the future of warfare and of the world itself. At its peak, Okinawa was a hellscape where the boundaries between life and death had blurred with a terrifying ease. Tens of thousands of soldiers, of sailors, and of civilians were caught in a deadly crucible, a battle so immense and so brutal that its scale defies an easy comprehension. Yet amid the carnage, the story of Iceberg is more than a catalogue of destruction. It is a profound lesson in courage, in suffering, and in the devastating cost of war. The American forces, who were overwhelming in their numbers and their firepower, had assembled a juggernaut of men and of machines. Over 180,000 troops had landed on those shores, supported by a fleet of hundreds of ships and thousands of aircraft. This was the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific theater, a colossal endeavor that was designed to break the last Japanese line of defense before the planned invasion of the Japanese mainland. But as the ground had shaken and the ocean had churned, the commanders and the soldiers alike would learn that Okinawa was a far different enemy than any that they had faced before. The Japanese defenders, who were entrenched in a fortress of caves, of tunnels, and of rugged terrain, had fought with a desperation that was born of honor and of despair. Their resolve had turned the island into a fortress of death, exacting a price that was far higher than even the most seasoned of the Allied commanders had anticipated. The ferocity of the kamikaze attacks, the cunning of the defensive lines, and the tragic involvement of the civilians had blurred the lines between the battlefield and the home, between the soldier and the survivor. Operation Iceberg had revealed the terrifying reality of a total war, a conflict where every inch of the land was contested, and every life was a casualty that was waiting to happen. It had exposed the limits of conventional warfare, and had foreshadowed the horrors that the planned invasion of Japan would have brought. The battle's staggering death toll, over 12,000 American lives, more than 190,000 Japanese soldiers, and tens of thousands of civilians, had stood as a grim testament to the price of victory. But the echoes of Okinawa did not end with the surrender. The lessons that had been carved out in blood and in fire had shaped the military doctrine for decades. The underground fortifications had become a stark symbol of a defensive ingenuity, forcing the armies worldwide to reconsider how they had fought in a rugged, fortified terrain. The kamikaze, a shocking and devastating tactic, had introduced a new dimension to air warfare, the willingness to die as a weapon, a grim precursor to the ideological conflicts of the Cold War era. Okinawa had also forced a brutal reckoning with the limits of human endurance. It had challenged the commanders on both sides to confront the thin line between a tactical success and a catastrophic loss. General Simon Buckner's death, the highest-ranking American officer to be killed by enemy fire in the war, had underscored the personal risks that had been borne by those in command. The Japanese generals Ushijima and Cho, who had chosen ritual suicide over surrender, had symbolized the cultural and the ideological divides that had shaped the conflict. For the civilians of Okinawa, the battle was nothing less than a tragedy of epic proportions. The families were torn apart, the communities were shattered, and an entire culture was forever altered. The island's children, some of whom had been forced into combat, and others who were struggling to survive amidst the ruins, had carried the scars that would never fully heal. Their stories remind us that war's true cost is not just measured in military terms, but in the lives of the ordinary people who are caught in extraordinary circumstances. The strategic significance of Okinawa cannot be overstated. It had provided the Allied forces with a critical base of operations, a stepping stone for the planned invasion of Japan. Its capture had tightened the noose around the Japanese Empire and had hastened the end of the war in the Pacific. Yet, it had also demonstrated the staggering human cost that such an invasion would have exacted, a reality that had weighed heavily on the American leaders and had ultimately influenced the fateful decision to deploy the atomic weapons. Okinawa's legacy is etched not only in the history books, but in the lives of those who had fought and had survived. The veterans on both sides had carried the weight of their experiences long after the guns had fallen silent. Their testimonies, their letters, and their memoirs offer the haunting insights into the realities of combat, of sacrifice, and of the search for meaning in the midst of the chaos. The battle had also served as a somber reminder of the horrors of war and of the need for peace. On the island today, the memorials and the peace parks stand as testaments to those who had been lost and as warnings to the future generations. These sacred spaces encourage a reflection, a mourning, and a collective resolve to prevent such a devastation from happening again. As the world had moved into the nuclear age, the echoes of Okinawa had haunted the policymakers and the citizens alike. The prospect of an invasion of Japan had loomed as a nightmare scenario, one that had been made all the more real by the brutal lessons that had been learned on this small island. The immense casualties at Okinawa had made it clear that the war's end could not have come without an unimaginable suffering, a realization that had forever altered the course of history. The battle's name, iceberg, is fitting. Like the hidden mass beneath the ocean's surface, much of what had occurred on Okinawa remains submerged in the collective memory, overshadowed by the larger narratives of World War II. Yet, its significance is profound. Beneath the visible scars lies a story of human endurance, of tragedy, and of transformation. And so, as we look back on Okinawa, we see more than just a battle. We see a crucible where the fear limits of courage, of cruelty, and of resilience were tested, a place where history's tides had turned, shaping the future of warfare and of international relations, a story of soldiers and of civilians, of leaders and of followers, of life and of death, of honor and of loss. The echoes of Iceberg remind us that war is never a simple tale of victory or of defeat. It is a complex mosaic of human experience, of pain and of pride, of horror and of hope, of destruction and of renewal. The island's story urges us to remember the cost of conflict and to strive relentlessly for peace. But the past is never fully past. The shadows of Okinawa still linger, challenging each new generation to listen, to learn, and to choose a different path. What will we hear in these echoes, and how will we answer their call? The story of Okinawa is not just history, it is a living testament, a mirror that is reflecting the darkest depths of human conflict and the brightest hopes for a better tomorrow. The echoes of Iceberg are clear, peace is fragile, sacrifice is immense, and the lessons of the past must never be forgotten. When the last rifle shot echoed across the southern cliffs, and the smoke finally cleared, Okinawa was revealed not as a conquered territory, but as an island of ghosts. This was more than a battle. It was a descent into a new kind of hell, where the sky rained fire, the earth became a tomb, and the sea itself burned. The victory was absolute, but its cost was unspeakable. A price paid in the blood of soldiers and the very soul of the Okinawan people. The sheer ferocity of this final battle, the Kamikaze storms, the fanatical defense of the Shuri Line, and the unimaginable civilian suffering, served as a terrifying preview of a full-scale invasion of Japan. The staggering casualties suffered on this small island became the final grim calculation in the decision to end the war. The road from Okinawa's shattered ridges led directly to the atomic dawn over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Today, the island stands as a solemn testament to the price of total war and the suffering of the innocent. Its legacy is not one of triumph, but of memory and mourning, a quiet, constant reminder that the cost of peace can be as devastating as war itself, and a plea that such a price must never be paid again.